The day my wife died, I thought the hardest thing I would ever have to face was learning how to live without her. I was wrong. The real shock came 7 days later when her will was read, and my own son looked at me as if I were a stranger. I had spent 40 years building a family, only to discover that my son had been waiting for an inheritance while my wife had been quietly preparing something neither of us expected. Hey everyone, welcome to today's story. Before we begin, take a second to like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. Quick note, this story includes fictional elements for storytelling purposes, but the message behind it is what truly matters. Now, let's see what Sam discovered. The mahogany table in our family home had never felt so large. It stretched between me and my son like a wall neither of us was willing to cross. At the head of the table sat Helen Sinclair, the attorney who had handled my wife's affairs for years. Her leather portfolio was open and a pair of reading glasses rested low on her nose. Across from me sat my son, Walter, with his wife, Jessica. They looked tense, but there was something else in their expressions. Expectation. They weren't grieving anymore. At least, not the way I was. It had been 7 days since Harold, my wife of nearly 43 years, had passed away. 7 days of casseroles from neighbors, flowers I couldn't bring myself to look at, and endless condolences that seemed to come from somewhere far away. Walter had spent most of that week telling people he was taking care of everything. But now, sitting across from him, I realized he wasn't waiting for closure. He was waiting for numbers. Helen cleared her throat. Thank you both for coming. We'll begin the reading of Harold Caldwell Rutherford's last will and testament. Walter straightened immediately. Jessica reached beneath the table and squeezed his hand. Helen began with the family residence. To my beloved son, Walter James Rutherford, I leave the property located in Southern Hills, Oklahoma. She paused. Current appraised value, $3.5 million. Jessica's eyes widened. Walter leaned back with a slow smile. I felt something inside me go quiet. That house had been my home too. Harold and I had raised Walter there. Every birthday, every Christmas, every difficult night and happy morning had happened under that roof. But apparently none of that mattered anymore. Helen continued reading. Then she reached my name. To my husband, Sam Rutherford, I leave the farm property in Osage County, including the farmhouse, barns, acreage, and all associated mineral and land rights. Walter's smile disappeared. He looked at Helen, then at me. The farm, he said. His voice carried something close to disbelief. That's it. Helen didn't answer. Walter turned toward me. Dad, you can't be serious. I hadn't written the will. I hadn't chosen the inheritance. But somehow I already felt guilty. Then Walter laughed bitterly. She gave you that rundown place while I got the house. He shook his head. You don't even know what you're supposed to do with a farm like that. I looked down at my hands. Maybe he was right. I'd never even seen the property properly. As far as I knew, it was an old piece of land Harold had inherited years ago and rarely mentioned. But then Helen reached into her portfolio and placed a small, rusty key on the table. There's one more thing, she said quietly. Harold specifically instructed me to give this to Sam. I picked it up. It was cold against my palm. What does it open? I asked. Helen looked directly into my eyes. You'll find out when you open the farmhouse door. I thought that was the end of the surprises. I couldn't have been more wrong. Because before that night was over, Walter would tell me to leave the only home I'd ever known, and I would soon discover that the worthless farm my wife left me was hiding something my son would do almost anything to possess. Walter left the room without waiting for my answer. The door clicked shut behind him, and for several seconds I simply stared at the eviction notice lying across my knees. 22 days. That was all he was giving me. 22 days to leave the house where Harold and I had spent nearly 2 decades together, the house where we had raised Walter, celebrated birthdays, survived arguments, and built the kind of memories I thought could never be taken away. But apparently, memories had no value on a legal document. The paper in my hand said Walter owned the property now, and he intended to make sure I understood that fact. I folded the notice carefully and placed it inside my old briefcase. Then I looked at the rusty key Helen had given me. "Trust the farm," Harold had whispered to me near the end of her life. I still couldn't understand what she meant. The farm was supposed to be an old, neglected piece of land somewhere west of the city. 800 acres of fields, a weather-beaten farmhouse, a barn, and nothing more. At least, that's what Walter seemed to believe. The next morning, I woke before sunrise to the sound of engines. At first, I thought it was traffic outside. Then came the metallic clanging, voices, and the unmistakable sound of heavy equipment moving across the driveway. I pulled back the curtain and froze. 3 contractor trucks were parked outside. Men in work boots were carrying ladders, drills, toolboxes, and demolition equipment toward the house. Walter stood near the front porch holding a coffee cup as though he were supervising an ordinary renovation. I rushed downstairs. "What are they doing?" I demanded. Walter barely looked at me. "Updating the house." "Updating," I repeated. "You didn't tell me anything," he shrugged. "It's my house now." Before I could respond, I heard a loud crash from the hallway. Harold's office. I ran toward the sound and stopped in the doorway. 2 workers were pulling books from the shelves and throwing them into large black bags. Another man was removing the brass nameplate from Harold's office door. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Those books weren't expensive antiques. They were Harold's books. Her handwritten notes were tucked between the pages. Some had belonged to her father. Others had been gifts from me during our marriage. "Stop!" I shouted. One of the workers stepped back. Walter appeared behind me. "Dad, don't make this difficult. That's your mother's office. It's a room in my house." His words hit harder than I expected. I looked at him, trying to find the little boy who once sat beside me while Harold taught him how to plant roses. But that boy seemed to have disappeared. "Walter, at least let me take her things," he sighed impatiently. "I've already made an inventory. The silverware, artwork, jewelry, everything valuable stays here." "I don't want your valuables," I said. "I want my wife's things." He stared at me for a moment before saying something that made my stomach turn. "You should be grateful I'm giving you 22 days. Then he walked away. I stood in Harold's office surrounded by half-empty shelves and scattered papers. On the desk was a photograph of Harold and me from our 30th anniversary. I picked it up and wiped the dust from the frame. That's when I noticed something behind the photograph. A thin envelope had been tucked between the frame and the wooden backing. My name was written across it in Harold's handwriting. My hands began to shake. I opened it carefully. Inside was only one sentence. "Sam, when Walter tells you the farm is worthless, believe me, he is lying." I read it twice. Then I heard footsteps approaching behind me. And when I turned around, Walter was standing in the doorway, staring directly at the envelope in my hand. Walter stood in the doorway, staring at the envelope in my hand. For a moment, neither of us spoke. His eyes moved from my face to the handwriting on the paper, and something changed in his expression. It wasn't anger at first. It was fear. Just for a second, but I saw it. Then the mask returned. "What's that?" he asked. I held the envelope against my chest. "Something your mother left for me." Walter stepped inside. "You shouldn't be going through things that belong to the estate. It has my name on it." "That doesn't mean anything." His voice became sharper. "Dad, you're grieving. You need to stop looking for hidden meanings in everything." I almost laughed. Hidden meanings? Harold had spent more than 40 years beside me. She knew exactly how I thought. If she had left me a note warning me about the farm, there was a reason. "Why are you so worried about a piece of paper?" I asked. Walter's jaw tightened. "I'm not worried." "You look worried." He took another step toward me. "Give it to me." I didn't. Instead, I folded the note and slipped it into my shirt pocket. Walter stared at me for several seconds before turning away. "Fine, keep it. But don't expect me to clean up whatever mess your wife left behind." He walked out, but this time he didn't slam the door. Somehow, that made it worse. I waited until I heard his footsteps disappear downstairs before looking around Harold's office again. The room had been disturbed but not completely destroyed. Papers were scattered across the desk. A few drawers stood open. Then I remembered something Harold had told me months before she died. "If anything ever happens to me, Sam, don't let Walter rush you into a decision." At the time, I had assumed she was simply worried about me making choices while grieving. Now, those words sounded different. I opened the desk drawers one by one. Receipts, old photographs, medical papers, nothing unusual. Then I found a small leather notebook hidden beneath a stack of insurance documents. Harold's handwriting covered the first few pages. Most of it was ordinary household information, but several entries caught my attention. Dates, names, numbers. And besides several of them, the same initials, VH. I didn't know who VH was. Before I could read further, I heard Walter's voice from downstairs. "Dad." I quickly closed the notebook and slipped it into my coat pocket. "Coming," I called. When I reached the hallway, Walter was standing beside two men in suits. Neither looked like a contractor. One carried a leather briefcase. The other held a folder. "Who are they?" I asked. Walter smiled without warmth. "These are people who can help you." "Help me with what?" The man with the briefcase stepped forward. "Mr. Rutherford, I'm Daniel Pierce. I'm an estate consultant working with your son." "I didn't hire an estate consultant." "Walter did." I looked at my son. "Why?" Walter crossed his arms. "Because you're about to move to the farm and there are financial matters that need to be handled." I felt a chill run through me. "What financial matters?" Daniel opened his folder. "Your wife's estate, your monthly expenses, property maintenance, medical planning. Given your age and recent bereavement, we recommend establishing a temporary financial authority." I stared at him. "Authority over what?" He glanced at Walter. "Your accounts, your property, certain legal decisions." My stomach tightened. Walter suddenly looked less like my son and more like a businessman negotiating a contract. "It's temporary, Dad," he said, "just until you get settled." I remembered Harold's note. "Don't let Walter rush you into a decision." "No," I said. Walter's expression hardened. "You don't even understand what you're refusing." "I understand enough." I walked past them and returned to the office. I pulled Harold's notebook from my pocket and opened it again. This time, one line near the bottom of the page stopped me cold. "If Walter asks Sam to sign anything after my death, call Helen immediately." My hands went numb. Harold hadn't merely expected Walter to pressure me. She had planned for it, and whatever she had discovered about our son must have been serious enough that she was afraid of what he might do once she was gone. I looked toward the hallway. Walter was still there, watching me, but he had no idea that his mother's final warning had just changed everything. And then, on the next page of the notebook, I found a name I had never heard before, and beside it were three words that made my blood run cold. "He knows everything." The name in Harold's notebook was still burning in my mind, Victor Hartman. I had never heard it before, yet Harold had written three words beneath his name that made no sense to me. "He knows everything." I closed the notebook and slipped it back inside my coat just as Walter entered the room again. His expression had changed. He no longer looked angry. He looked impatient. "Dad, we need to talk about your living arrangements," he said. "I'm not going anywhere tonight." "I'm not asking you to leave tonight. I'm asking you to start thinking practically." He placed another folder on the desk. "This is a power of attorney agreement. It will make things easier while you transition." I didn't touch it. "I already told you no." Walter sighed. "You're making this harder than it has to be. Maybe because you're asking me to hand you control of everything I have left." His face hardened. "Everything you have left, Dad, you're acting like I'm stealing from you." I stared at him. "Are you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he picked up the folder and walked toward the door. You have 22 days. After that, you're out. The door closed behind him. I sat there alone, realizing something terrifying. Walter wasn't simply trying to make me move. He was trying to make sure that before I left, I surrendered control of my finances and the farm. Harold had known this would happen. But why? The following afternoon, Walter returned with a different attitude. He brought no lawyer this time. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and tried to sound like the son I remembered. "Dad, I know this is difficult. Then stop making it worse." He looked down at his hands. "I don't want us fighting." I almost believed him. Then he pushed a document across the table. "Sell me the farm." I stared at him. "What?" "I'll make it easy. $50,000. Cash." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You want to buy Harold's farm. It's an old property nobody wants." "Then why do you want it?" He hesitated for half a second. "Because I'm trying to help you. You just offered me $50,000 for 800 acres. Walter leaned forward. "Dad, you don't understand rural property values. There's a huge tax problem. If you don't pay it, the county could take the land." That was the first time I had heard about any tax problem. "How much?" "Around 18,000. My stomach dropped. My pension barely covered my living expenses. Walter knew that. He also knew I couldn't simply produce $18,000. "So you want me to sell because I'm desperate?" I asked. "I'm giving you a way out." He tapped the contract. "Sign it, take the money, and forget about the farm." I pushed the paper back. "I'll think about it." His smile disappeared. "You don't have much time." After he left, I sat on the porch and stared into the darkness. Then my phone rang. It was Helen. "Sam, Walter contacted me today," she said. "He asked whether the estate could release the farm from its obligations. He offered me $50,000. "I know." Her voice became firm. "Don't sell." I looked toward the driveway. "Helen, I can't afford an $18,000 tax bill. You don't have to worry about that yet." "What does that mean?" She paused. "Harold planned for this." My heart started pounding. "Planned for what?" "For Walter to pressure you, for you to feel trapped, even for the tax issue." I sat upright. "Helen, what aren't you telling me?" Her voice softened. "The farm isn't what Walter thinks it is." I remembered Harold's note. "Trust the farm." "Then tell me the truth." "I can't," she whispered. "Not yet." "Why?" "Because Harold made me promise." "You have to discover it yourself." I gripped the phone. "How long?" 2 days. She continued. "On March 29th, go to the farm alone. Open the envelope Harold left for you. And whatever Walter tells you before then, don't sign anything." I looked down at the rusty key sitting beside me. "Helen, is the farm really worth more than he says?" There was a long silence. Then she answered with words that changed everything. "Sam, the farm is protected. And Walter knows something about that land that you don't." The call ended, leaving me staring into the darkness. I barely slept that night. But the next morning, an official envelope arrived from the county assessor. I opened it expecting another ordinary tax notice. Instead, the first line made my heart stop. The property had been placed under a special assessment I had never heard of. And beneath that was a deadline that gave me only days to discover why Harold had fought so hard to keep that land in my name. The county notice sat on my kitchen table all night. I kept reading the same sentence over and over, hoping I had misunderstood it. The farm had an outstanding tax obligation, and the deadline was approaching much faster than I expected. For the first time since Harold's death, I understood why Walter had been so confident. He knew I was living on a pension. He knew I didn't have $18,000 sitting in a bank account. And now he had offered me $50,000 for a property he insisted was nearly worthless. The numbers didn't make sense. By sunrise, I had made a decision. I was going to Helen's office. I needed answers, even if she had promised Harold she wouldn't tell me everything. When I arrived, Helen was already waiting in a small conference room. A manila envelope rested on the table in front of her. I stopped when I saw it. My name was written across the front in Harold's unmistakable handwriting. "What is that?" I asked. Helen pushed it toward me. The second letter, I didn't touch it immediately. Harold left this. Yes. She gave me instructions about when you were supposed to receive it. And when was that? Helen glanced at the calendar. Today. I slowly picked up the envelope. It was sealed. What's inside? Helen shook her head. I don't know. You don't know? Harold sealed it herself. I never opened it. I looked at her suspiciously. Then why did she leave it with you? Helen folded her hands on the table. Because she knew there would come a point when you would stop trusting what Walter told you. That sentence hurt more than anything else. I wanted to believe my son was simply making terrible decisions because he was grieving, but Harold had prepared for this long before she died. Helen, tell me the truth about the farm. She took a slow breath. I can tell you what I am legally allowed to tell you. Then tell me everything. The farm was placed into an irrevocable trust 18 months ago. I stared at her. What does that mean? It means Walter cannot take control of it through a power of attorney. He cannot simply force a sale. The property is protected, and Harold structured the trust specifically to keep it from being transferred under pressure. I looked down at the envelope in my hands. Why would she do that? Helen's expression softened. Because she knew someone would try to take it. Walter, she didn't answer directly. Harold was very specific about your son. My throat tightened. She didn't trust him. Helen shook her head slowly. Not anymore. I leaned back in my chair. Then why didn't she tell me? Because she believed you would confront Walter before she had finished preparing everything. That sounded exactly like Harold. She had always known me too well. Helen continued, there is another reason you should not sell. I looked up. The farm is worth far more than Walter's offer. How much? I can't give you a number yet. Helen, he offered $50,000, and he didn't make that offer because he was being generous. Her voice became firm. He is desperate. I remembered Walter's face when he asked me to sell. There had been no pity in his eyes, only urgency. What does he know? I asked. Helen looked at the envelope. That's what Harold wanted you to discover at the farm. She paused. Go there tomorrow, alone, and open this. Yes, both envelopes. Harold's instructions were very clear. I nodded slowly. What about the tax bill? Don't worry about the auction, I frowned. Why? Because the trust has a provision for delinquent taxes. I've already filed an extension request. You have until June 30th to resolve it. Relief washed over me, but Helen wasn't finished. Sam, there's one more thing. What? If Walter asks you to sign anything, don't. Anything, power of attorney, sales agreement, financial authorization, nothing. I remembered the folder he had left on my desk. You think he'll try again? Helen looked directly into my eyes. I know he will. I left her office carrying the second envelope and more questions than answers. On the drive home, I passed the road leading toward the farm. I almost turned the steering wheel, but Harold had asked me to wait one more day. That evening, Walter called. Dad, have you thought about my offer? I said nothing for several seconds. Yes, and I'm going to the farm tomorrow. Silence filled the phone. Then Walter said something that made the hairs on my arms rise. Dad, don't open that door. I froze. He hadn't asked what I was doing there. He already knew. And suddenly I understood the most frightening part of all. Walter wasn't afraid of me selling the farm. He was afraid of me discovering what was inside it. Walter's warning followed me through the entire night. Dad, don't open that door. I kept replaying those words until they stopped sounding like a warning and started sounding like a confession. Why would my son care whether I opened the door of an abandoned farmhouse? If the property was truly worthless, he should have laughed and let me go. Instead, he sounded frightened. I barely slept. Before sunrise, I packed a small bag, placed Harold's 2 envelopes inside my coat, and put the rusty key in my pocket. I didn't tell Walter when I was leaving. I didn't tell Jessica. I didn't even tell my closest neighbor. Helen had told me to go alone, and for once I intended to follow someone's advice. The drive to Osage County took nearly 2 hours. The city disappeared behind me, replaced by open fields, old fences, and long stretches of empty road. As I drove farther west, I started remembering the last time Harold and I had visited the farm together. It had been almost 2 years earlier. She had stood in the middle of a wheat field, holding her hat against the wind, and looked across the land with an expression I couldn't understand. "This place still has something left to give us," she had said. I had laughed and told her the only thing the farm needed was a bulldozer. She had smiled. "Just wait." At the time, I thought she was joking. Now I wasn't so sure. When I finally turned onto the dirt road leading to the property, I slowed the truck. The farmhouse appeared in the distance. It looked worse than I remembered. The paint had faded almost completely. One window was cracked. The porch leaned slightly to one side, and weeds had swallowed most of the steps. If Walter had shown this property to a realtor, they probably would have laughed at the $50,000 offer being called generous. I parked beside the porch and stepped out. The wind moved through the tall grass with a low whisper. For a few seconds, I just stood there. This was the place Harold had chosen for me. I pulled out the key. It fit the lock perfectly. I turned it. The door opened with a long, rusty groan. A smell of dust, old wood, and something faintly familiar drifted through the doorway. I stepped inside. The farmhouse was almost completely empty. There was an old dining table, a broken lamp, 2 chairs, and several pieces of furniture covered with white sheets. But there was something strange about the room. It didn't look abandoned. It looked prepared. I walked slowly from room to room. In the kitchen, the cabinets were empty. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms contained nothing except cobwebs and dust. Then I entered the small bedroom at the back of the house. On the wall was an old framed photograph of Harold standing beside a man I didn't recognize. I lifted the frame from the wall. Behind it was a narrow wooden compartment. Inside was a small metal box. My heart started pounding. I pulled it out and noticed something engraved on the lid. HR. 1987. Harold's initials. I tried the latch, but it was locked. I searched my pockets, then remembered the second key Helen had given me months earlier with some estate papers. I had almost forgotten about it. I tried the key. The box opened. Inside was a folded map, a photograph, and a handwritten card. The card contained only 6 words. "Start with the old barn, Sam." I looked through the window toward the barn standing nearly 200 yards behind the farmhouse. Its roof was partially collapsed, but the doors were still closed. I folded the card and put everything back in my pocket. Then I heard a vehicle approaching from the road. I stepped onto the porch and looked toward the driveway. A black SUV was coming slowly through the dust. I couldn't see the driver clearly, but I already knew who it was. Walter had followed me. I reached for my phone, but before I could call Helen, the SUV stopped. Walter stepped out and looked toward the farmhouse. He didn't look angry. He looked terrified. Then he pointed toward the barn and shouted, "Dad, whatever you find in there, you need to leave it alone." I stared at him from the porch. He had just confirmed the one thing I was beginning to suspect. Whatever Harold had hidden on this farm wasn't just valuable. It was dangerous enough to make my own son follow me across the state. Walter stood beside his SUV with his arms crossed, staring at me as if he had expected me to turn around and go home. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. The farmhouse behind me suddenly felt different. A few minutes earlier, it had looked like an abandoned building. Now it felt like a locked room filled with answers. "How did you know I was coming here?" I finally asked. Walter looked toward the ground. "I know you, Dad. I knew you wouldn't stay in that house after what happened." "That's not what I asked." He stepped closer. "You shouldn't be here alone." "Why?" "Because the property isn't safe." I almost smiled. "Funny. Yesterday you told me it was worthless." His face tightened. "I never said that. You offered me $50,000 for it, because you're not in a position to maintain it." "Then why are you following me?" Walter didn't answer. Instead, he looked past me toward the farmhouse. His eyes settled on the old barn. I watched him carefully. "What's in there?" I asked. "Nothing." His answer came too quickly. I knew immediately that he was lying. Then why did you tell me not to open the door? I was talking about the farmhouse. Why? He rubbed his forehead. Dad, please just come home. No, you don't understand what's happening. Then explain it. Walter looked at me for a long moment. I can't. That was all he said before walking back toward his SUV. Walter, I called after him. He stopped. If you know something about this property, tell me. He slowly turned around. Some things are better left buried. Then he got into the SUV and drove away. I watched the dust settle behind him. My hands were shaking, but not from fear anymore. I was angry. I went back inside the farmhouse and locked the door. The second envelope from Helen was still in my coat pocket. I placed it on the table and stared at it. Harold had sent me here for a reason. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single page. Sam, if you're reading this, you've reached the place Harold wanted you to see. Go to the barn. Look for the attic entrance in the northwest corner. You will find a trunk there. Use the old key. Do not open anything until you are alone. I read the final line twice. The truth is in the barn. I folded the letter and headed outside. The barn looked enormous up close. Its wooden doors were warped and one side of the roof sagged badly. I pushed the door open. Dust filled the air. Sunlight slipped through holes in the boards, creating narrow beams across the floor. Old farming equipment sat along the walls. Broken tools, empty barrels, wooden crates. Nothing seemed unusual. Then I remembered the note, northwest corner. I walked toward it and found a stack of old hay bales. Behind them was a narrow wooden ladder leading upward. My heart began pounding. I climbed slowly. The attic was darker than I expected. I turned on my flashlight and swept the beam across the rafters. There were old boxes everywhere, but nothing resembling a trunk. I searched for nearly 10 minutes before finding a faded canvas sheet covering something large. I pulled it away. Beneath it sat a military-style metal trunk reinforced with steel corners. A brass lock held it shut. I pulled Harold's rusty key from my pocket. It fit perfectly. The lock opened with a heavy click. I lifted the lid. Inside were several folders, each marked in Harold's handwriting. One said Geological Survey. Another said Walter. A third had a red tab labeled Evidence. The final folder had a blue tab and two words that made my stomach tighten, Victor Hartman. Beneath the folders was another envelope with my name on it. I picked it up, but before opening it, I heard the barn door slam downstairs. I froze. Someone was inside. I switched off my flashlight and listened. Footsteps moved slowly across the barn floor. Then a man's voice called from below, "Sam, are you up there?" I didn't recognize the voice. I gripped the envelope tightly. The footsteps stopped directly beneath the ladder. Then the stranger said something that made my blood run cold. "Harold told me you'd eventually find this place." The voice below the attic belonged to an older man. I stayed completely still, barely breathing while his footsteps moved across the dusty floor beneath me. For a few seconds, I wondered if I had made a terrible mistake coming here alone. Then the man spoke again. "Sam, I know you're up there." I slowly switched on my flashlight and looked toward the ladder. An older face appeared between the beams. He wore a faded work jacket, dusty boots, and a worn baseball cap. His expression wasn't threatening. If anything, he looked tired. "Who are you?" I asked. "My name is Earl." He climbed the ladder slowly and stopped several feet away from me. "Harold told me about you." My heart skipped. "You knew my wife?" Earl nodded. "For a long time." I tightened my grip on the envelope. "Why didn't I know about you?" He gave a quiet laugh. "Because Harold didn't want you to know." That answer only created more questions. "Why?" Earl looked toward the metal trunk. "Because she knew Walter was watching everything." I stared at him. "Walter, your son isn't the only person interested in this property." Earl walked closer and pointed toward the folders. "Harold asked me to keep an eye on the farm after she got sick." "Keep an eye on it for what?" He hesitated. "To make sure nobody came here looking for what she buried." I felt a chill move down my back. What did she bury? Earl shook his head. Not buried, hidden. He pointed toward the envelope in my hand. That's why you're holding that. I looked at the handwriting. Did Harold tell you what was inside? No. She told me I wasn't supposed to open anything. She said you had to discover the truth yourself. Earl moved toward the trunk and examined the folders. You found the geological report already. I haven't opened it. Good. He nodded. Then you still have a chance to understand this before Walter makes another move. What exactly is Walter trying to do? Earl's face became serious. Get control of the land. Why? Because the land is valuable. I almost laughed. Walter told me it was worthless. Earl looked directly at me. Walter has been lying to you. That sentence echoed through the attic. I opened the folder marked Geological Survey. Inside were maps, charts, and several technical reports. I couldn't understand most of the terminology, but one phrase appeared repeatedly: Mississippian Lime Formation. Beneath it were estimated production figures and geological measurements. What am I looking at? I asked. Earl pointed to the map. Your property sits over a formation energy companies have been studying for years. Oil, I whispered. He nodded. Oil and gas potential. My hands became cold. How much? Earl shook his head. I don't know the exact number. Harold wouldn't tell me, but I know enough to understand why people are willing to fight over this land. Suddenly, Walter's $50,000 offer seemed ridiculous. Earl noticed the expression on my face. Now you understand why he wanted you to leave. I looked at the red folder labeled Evidence. What's in there? Everything Harold collected. About Walter, Earl nodded. Bank records, copies of agreements, photographs, names. I opened the folder and saw the first page. There were several withdrawals from an account I recognized. My account. I stared at the dates. Thousands of dollars had disappeared over a period of months. I didn't make these withdrawals. Earl remained silent. Who did? I asked. You already know. My stomach dropped. Walter, Earl nodded. Harold discovered it before she died. I looked down at the papers again. The amounts were larger than I could comprehend. But before I could examine them further, Earl reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded photograph. He handed it to me. It showed Walter standing beside another man outside an office building. On the back, Harold had written a date and a single sentence. They think the farm belongs to them. I looked at Earl. Who is the other man? Earl's expression darkened. Victor Hartman, the same name from Harold's notebook. I suddenly understood that Walter's plan had been operating long before Harold died. But there was still one question I couldn't answer. Why had Harold waited until after her death to reveal all of this? Earl looked at the final envelope in my hand. Open that, he said quietly. Because Harold didn't just leave you evidence. He paused. She left you a way to fight back. And when I finally broke the seal, the first line inside made me realize the truth was far worse than I had imagined. I broke the seal with trembling fingers. For a moment, I couldn't bring myself to look at the page. Harold's handwriting was there, exactly as I remembered it, slightly slanted, careful, and unmistakably hers. I took a slow breath and began reading. Sam, if you are holding this letter, then you finally made it to the farm. I wish I could have told you everything while I was alive, but I was afraid that speaking too soon would put you in danger. I stopped reading for a moment. In danger. I looked toward Earl. He had gone completely silent. Keep going, he said quietly. I lowered my eyes to the page again. Harold wrote that there were 3 things I needed to understand. The first concerned Walter. She had discovered that our son had been secretly taking money from accounts connected to the family. At first, she thought it might have been an accounting mistake. Then the withdrawals became too frequent to ignore. She began checking statements herself. What she discovered was devastating. Walter had been moving money through different accounts and using documents that appeared to carry Harold's authorization. But the signatures weren't hers. They were forged. The total loss was enormous, far beyond anything I could have imagined. Harold had documented each transaction. saved copies of the withdrawal slips, and even collected evidence showing Walter appearing at a bank during one of the suspicious withdrawals. I lowered the letter and stared into the darkness of the attic. My son had stolen from us. Not once, not because of some desperate emergency. He had been doing it repeatedly while Harold was sick. I remembered those nights when I sat beside my wife, helping her drink water, adjusting her pillows, reading to her when she couldn't sleep. All that time, Walter had apparently been moving our money behind our backs, but Harold's next revelation was even worse. She wrote that Walter had been working with a man named Victor Hartman, a powerful figure in the Oklahoma oil business. Their plan, according to Harold, was to make me dependent on Walter. They intended to push me toward assisted living, gain control of my affairs through legal pressure, and eventually obtain control of the farm. Then they would sell the property for its drilling potential. I looked at Earl. He was going to put me in a nursing home. Earl nodded slowly. That's what Harold believed. My own son. I'm afraid so. I felt my chest tighten. Harold had anticipated the exact thing Walter had already tried to do. The power of attorney documents, the pressure to leave the house, the offer to buy the farm. None of it was random. It was a plan. Then I reached the third part of the letter and my entire understanding of the farm changed. Harold explained that the property sat above a geological formation with significant oil potential. According to the surveys she had collected, the estimated recoverable value could be around $25 million. I stared at the number. $25 million. The farm Walter had called worthless. The land he wanted to buy for $50,000. The property I had nearly dismissed because it looked abandoned. Suddenly, everything made sense. Walter hadn't been trying to help me. He had been trying to buy the farm before I learned what it was actually worth. Harold had even taken steps to protect me. She had placed the property into an irrevocable trust in my name, meaning Walter couldn't simply seize it through the authority he had been trying to obtain. I felt tears gathering in my eyes. Harold had been dying, yet she had still been protecting me. She had known what Walter was doing and had spent her final months building a shield around me. At the bottom of the letter, she wrote one final message. Sam, I know you still want to believe Walter is the boy who helped me plant roses, but he made his choices. Protect yourself, protect this land, trust the farm. I folded the letter against my chest. Earl placed a hand on my shoulder. There's more, he said. I looked at him. What could possibly be worse? He pointed toward the red folder. Harold didn't just leave you a warning, she left you proof. I opened it. The first page contained a detailed timeline of Walter's financial theft. The amounts added up to $370,000. My hands began shaking. But beneath the financial records was another document with Victor Hartman's name on it. I turned the page. The next sheet was an email between Walter and Victor, and in the middle of the conversation was one sentence Harold had highlighted in red. Once Sam signs the guardianship papers, the farm is ours. I stared at those words until they blurred. Then I heard Earl whisper, Sam, there's something else you need to see. He pointed toward the bottom of the folder. And this one could destroy Walter completely. The document at the bottom of the folder was a copy of a drilling agreement, and the name at the top made my stomach tighten, Morrison Energy. Harold had apparently been negotiating with the company long before her death. I read the first page twice, trying to understand what I was looking at. It wasn't a simple sale. It was a partnership agreement for exploration and drilling, with the company agreeing to cover the enormous costs of developing the property. In return, I would retain a substantial share of the future royalties. Harold had already built the path for me. All I had to do was follow it. But there was another document underneath the agreement, and that one changed the way I looked at Walter forever. It was a printed email between Walter and Victor Hartman. The conversation was dated months before Harold died. They discussed the farm, the mineral rights, and what they called the transition plan. I read the messages slowly. Walter had written that I was becoming increasingly dependent on others and would probably accept a move to assisted living if the right people convinced me it was necessary. Victor responded that once Walter obtained legal authority over my affairs, the rest would be easy. The final step would be convincing me to transfer the property. I felt sick. This wasn't a family disagreement. It was a calculated plan. Walter had been studying my weaknesses, waiting for the right opportunity and preparing to take control of my life. I remembered how quickly he had appeared after Harold's funeral, how he had immediately started talking about the house, how he'd brought lawyers to my kitchen table, how he'd offered $50,000 for hundreds of acres. Every moment suddenly fit together. Earl watched me carefully. Harold knew they were planning this, he said. She wanted to stop them without letting them know she was onto them. I turned another page. There were copies of bank statements, surveillance photographs, correspondence, and notes from meetings Harold had apparently arranged with attorneys. She had been building a case quietly. One handwritten note caught my attention. Don't confront Walter until the evidence is complete. Underneath it was another sentence. Sam must have the choice to decide what happens next. I felt tears in my eyes. Even at the end, Harold hadn't wanted revenge. She wanted me to have freedom. Why didn't she tell me? I whispered. Earl looked away. Because she knew you would confront Walter immediately. She was afraid he'd destroy the evidence or move faster. I closed my eyes. I remembered the last conversation I had with Harold. She had been lying in bed, exhausted, barely able to speak. I'd asked her if there was anything she needed. She had looked at me and said, "Just promise me you won't let anyone rush you." I thought she meant decisions about her funeral. Now I understood. She had been trying to protect me from our own son. I opened the blue folder next. Inside were documents connected to Victor Hartman. There were contracts, payment records, and copies of communications between him and Walter. One document showed that Victor's company had already prepared preliminary plans for drilling on the farm. They had acted as though the property was already theirs. I looked at Earl. They were preparing to drill before they even owned it. Exactly. How did Harold get all this? She had help. From whom? Earl hesitated. People you haven't met yet. Before I could ask what he meant, my phone vibrated. Walter was calling. I stared at the screen. Earl shook his head. "Don't answer." I answered anyway. "Dad," Walter said, sounding unusually calm, "where are you?" "At the farm." Silence. Then he asked, "Are you alone?" I looked at Earl. "Yes." "Good." His voice lowered. "Then listen carefully. You need to leave that place immediately." "Why?" "Because you're opening things you don't understand." "I understand enough." Walter exhaled sharply. "No, Dad, you don't." I could hear panic creeping into his voice. "That farm isn't what Mom told you it was." I stood up. "What did she tell me?" He didn't answer. "Walter," finally he said, "she lied to you." The call ended. I stared at the phone. Earl looked at me. "He knows you found something." I nodded. Then I noticed one final folder at the bottom of the trunk. It wasn't labeled with a name. It simply said, "Final Proof." I reached for it, but before I could open it, a vehicle engine roared outside. Earl moved toward the window. His face changed instantly. "Sam," he whispered. "We have company." I looked through the dusty glass and saw not one vehicle, but three. Walter had come back, and this time he hadn't come alone. The three vehicles stopped one after another outside the barn, and suddenly the quiet property felt like a battlefield. Earl moved toward the attic window and looked down through a narrow gap in the wooden boards. "There are 4 men with him," he whispered. "2 look like lawyers." I swallowed hard. "Why would Walter bring lawyers to an abandoned farm?" Earl gave me a grim look. "Because he knows you're no longer confused about what this place is worth." I looked at the metal trunk. The folder marked "Final Proof" was still unopened. "Then we need to know everything before he gets up here." Earl nodded. We quickly gathered the documents and placed them inside an old canvas bag. I kept the most important papers against my chest. Then we heard the barn doors open below. Walter's voice echoed through the building. Dad, I know you're up there. I didn't answer. He called again, louder this time. You don't understand what you're getting yourself into. Earl whispered, don't engage him. But Walter wasn't leaving. Dad, I brought people who can explain the legal situation. I almost laughed. The legal situation, I shouted back. Is that what we're calling it? Silence followed. Then Walter said, come down and talk to me. I looked at Earl. He shook his head. He's trying to get you alone. I stayed where I was. Why did you lie about the farm? I shouted. Walter didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said, because I was trying to protect you. From what? From people who will take advantage of you. I looked at the documents in my hands. Like you. The barn went silent. I heard Walter speaking quietly to someone below. Then footsteps moved toward the ladder. Earl reached for my arm. Don't let him see the documents. I stepped behind the trunk as Walter climbed into the attic. He appeared at the top of the ladder with a man in a dark suit behind him. The lawyer looked at me and smiled politely. Mr. Rutherford, I'm Michael Grant. We represent your son. Then you should tell him to leave. Walter climbed fully into the attic. Dad, this isn't about money. Everything you've done since Mom died has been about money. He flinched. You don't know the whole story. I pulled the drilling agreement from the bag. Then explain this. Walter's face went pale. The lawyer reached for the document, but I pulled it away. Morrison Energy, drilling rights, your name, Victor Hartman's name. How long have you known about the oil? Walter looked toward the lawyer. That one glance told me more than any answer could have. He knew I had found everything. Dad, please, he said quietly, listen to me. No, you listen to me. I held up the bank records. $370,000, forged signatures. Withdrawals, shell accounts. His face turned white. Mom was sick when you did this. I was going to pay it back. You stole from your dying mother. I said I was going to pay it back. His voice echoed through the barn. Earl stepped forward. And you planned to put Sam under guardianship. Walter stared at him. Who the hell are you? Someone Harold trusted. That sentence seemed to crush him. Walter looked at the floor. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then I remembered the final folder. I reached into the trunk and pulled it toward me. Walter saw it immediately. Dad, don't open that. I froze. Why? He swallowed. Because if you open it, there won't be any way back. I looked at the label. Final proof. There wasn't a way back the moment you decided to betray your mother. I opened the folder. Inside was a single contract. At the top was a company name I recognized from the earlier documents. Beneath it was a signature, Walter's signature. But this wasn't another drilling agreement. It was a document showing that Walter had already promised Victor control over the farm before Harold even died. The date was 18 months earlier. I stared at it in disbelief. You signed this while Mom was still alive. Walter closed his eyes. Dad, I turned the page. At the bottom was a handwritten note from Harold. If Walter ever denies this agreement, show him the second page. My fingers trembled as I turned it over. The second page contained something even more shocking, a clause that could strip Walter of his entire inheritance and expose the entire scheme to federal investigators. I looked at Walter. He knew what I had found. And for the first time since Harold died, my son looked genuinely afraid. The second page was a legal clause Harold had deliberately placed inside the trust documents. I read it slowly, making sure I understood every word. It stated that if Walter attempted to transfer the farm, challenge the trust through fraudulent means, or cooperate with Victor Hartman in any unauthorized transaction, he could lose the inheritance Harold had left him. There was more. The clause also required Helen to release the evidence to federal investigators if Walter continued his attempts to seize the property. I looked at Walter. Mom planned for this. He didn't answer. The lawyer beside him suddenly looked uncomfortable. Mr. Rutherford, he said carefully, perhaps we should discuss this somewhere more private. I shook my head. No. We've had enough private conversations. Walter stepped toward me. Dad, I made mistakes. Mistakes? I held up the bank records. You forged her signature. I was desperate. You stole hundreds of thousands of dollars. I was going to replace it. You planned to put me in a nursing facility." His voice broke. "I thought you weren't capable of managing the property." I stared at him. "You never even gave me a chance." He looked away. That was the moment I realized something. Walter didn't regret what he had done. He regretted getting caught. Earl stood quietly behind me, watching everything. The lawyer finally cleared his throat. "Walter, I think you should stop speaking." Walter turned toward him angrily. "Don't tell me what to do." The lawyer lowered his voice. "You need to understand what this document means." Walter looked back at me. "Dad, please give me the papers. We can fix this." I shook my head. "No, I'm your son. You stopped acting like my son a long time ago." Those words hurt me as much as they hurt him. Walter's eyes became wet, but I couldn't tell whether it was shame or frustration. He stepped backward. "Mom would never want this." I almost laughed. "Don't use her name to manipulate me." He stared at me, then his shoulders dropped. "What do you want?" I looked at the documents. "The truth." "You have it." "No, I have pieces. I want to know everything." Walter remained silent for several seconds. Finally, he admitted that he had met Victor almost 2 years earlier. Victor had told him the farm was sitting over valuable reserves, and that he could make Walter rich if he obtained control of the property. At first, Walter said he only intended to borrow against the land. Then the plan grew. They discussed drilling rights, a future sale, and how Walter could become conservator if I were declared incapable of managing my affairs. I listened without interrupting. Every confession felt like another piece of my family disappearing. "And Mom?" I asked. Walter looked down. "She found out." "When?" "Months before she died." "What did she say?" His face tightened. "She told me she would stop me." I closed my eyes. That sounded exactly like Harold. She had never been loud when she was angry. She became quiet, focused, determined. Walter continued, "I thought she'd eventually forgive me." I opened my eyes. "She didn't." He looked toward the ground. "I know." Then his lawyer stepped forward. "Walter, we need to leave." Walter nodded, but before he turned away, he looked at me one final time. "Dad, I'm sorry." I didn't answer. I couldn't. After they left, Earl and I remained in the attic. The barn became silent again. I sat beside the trunk, exhausted. "What happens now?" I asked. Earl said, "Now you call Helen." I pulled out my phone. Helen answered immediately, as though she had been waiting. "Sam, Helen, I found everything." She exhaled slowly. "Then it's time." "Time for what?" "To activate the protection Harold built for you." My heart started pounding. "What does that mean?" "It means Walter's actions have triggered the trust's ethics clause." She paused. "His inheritance is now at risk." I looked through the barn window toward the road where Walter's SUV had disappeared. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of what my son could do, but Helen's next words changed everything. "Sam, there's one more person you need to worry about." "Victor?" "Yes." Her voice became urgent. "Walter may have backed away, but Victor hasn't." I looked at Earl. He had already understood. Helen continued, "And if Victor realizes you have Harold's evidence, he won't wait for a court order." The line went silent for a moment. Then she whispered, "Sam, lock the farmhouse tonight. Because someone is already heading toward you." Helen's warning stayed with me long after the call ended. Someone was already heading toward me. I looked at Earl, and he didn't need me to explain. He had heard enough from my side of the conversation to understand what was happening. "We shouldn't stay here," he said. I nodded, but before we could leave the attic, headlights swept across the barn doors. A vehicle had turned onto the property. Earl moved toward the window and looked through a crack in the boards. "It's not Walter." My stomach tightened. "How do you know?" "Different vehicle. Black sedan." We watched it roll slowly toward the farmhouse and stop near the porch. No one got out. The engine remained running. For nearly a minute, nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened. A tall man stepped out wearing a dark coat. He stood beside the car and looked directly toward the barn. I felt a cold pressure in my chest. "Victor," I whispered. Earl shook his head. I've never seen him in person, but Harold described him. The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a phone. A moment later, mine began vibrating. Unknown number. I didn't answer. The call ended. Then another came. This time a message appeared. "Mr. Rutherford, we should talk before you make a serious mistake." I showed Earl. "How does he have my number?" Earl didn't answer. The message was followed by another. "Your wife understood the value of cooperation. I hope you do too." I felt anger replacing fear. Harold had spent her final months protecting me from people like this, and now they were standing outside the place she had chosen for me. "I'm calling the police," I said. Earl nodded. "Do it." I dialed, explained that someone connected to the estate dispute was on my property, and gave the location. While I was speaking, the man outside walked toward the farmhouse. He stopped at the porch and looked through the windows. Then he noticed the broken lock on the back door. "He knows we're here," Earl whispered. "How?" I asked. "Maybe he doesn't. Maybe he's guessing." But then the man's phone rang. He answered and looked directly toward the barn. My blood ran cold. He knew. We stayed silent until headlights appeared again in the distance. Another vehicle was approaching. The black sedan immediately backed away from the farmhouse and disappeared down the dirt road. A minute later, a county patrol vehicle arrived. The officer spoke with us, examined the property, and took down the details. He couldn't arrest anyone based solely on suspicion, but he advised me to stay somewhere secure. I thanked him and watched his vehicle leave. Earl turned to me. "You can't stay here tonight." "I'm not leaving," he frowned. "Sam, this is my property. Harold wanted me here." I walked back into the farmhouse and locked every door. Then I opened the second envelope again. I had read Harold's letter, but there was one paragraph I had overlooked. At the bottom, she had written, "When they come looking for the documents, don't give them the red folder, give them the copy." I stared at the sentence. Copy? What copy? I searched the farmhouse again. In the kitchen, beneath a loose floorboard, I found a small wooden box. Inside were photocopies of every important document from the barn. Harold had anticipated that someone might try to steal the originals. Earl smiled when I showed him. "Your wife was always 3 steps ahead." I nodded. Then I noticed another folded paper at the bottom of the box. It wasn't written by Harold. It was a typed agreement between Victor's company and Walter. The date was almost 2 years old. The agreement showed that Victor had promised Walter a $5 million payment once the farm's drilling rights were transferred. My heart sank. The $5 million wasn't connected to the penthouse Walter inherited. It was the money he expected to receive from selling the farm behind my back. I finally understood why he had been so desperate. The house was just his visible prize. The farm was the real fortune. I folded the document and placed it beside Harold's evidence. But then Earl noticed something on the final page. "Sam," he said quietly, "look at the signature." I did. It wasn't Walter's. It was someone else's. Someone I never expected to see connected to this scheme. Helen's name was printed at the bottom of the agreement. I stared at it in disbelief. "Helen." Earl's face went pale. "That doesn't make sense." But before we could investigate, my phone rang again. This time, the caller ID displayed Helen's name. I answered. There was silence on the other end. Then a man's voice whispered, "If you trust Helen, you're already in more danger than you realize." The voice on the phone wasn't Helen's. It was a man, calm and almost amused, telling me that trusting Helen could put me in greater danger. I stood completely still, staring at the screen after the call ended. Earl watched my face. "What did he say?" I told him. He didn't react immediately. Instead, he walked to the window and looked outside. "Did you recognize the voice?" "No." "Then don't assume the message is true." I nodded, but the document lying on the table still bothered me. Helen's name appeared at the bottom of an agreement connected to Victor. Was it really her signature? Or had someone used her name to make me doubt the one person Harold had trusted? I unfolded the document again. The signature looked convincing, but there was something strange about the date. The agreement was supposedly signed several months before Harold's death, yet Helen had been the attorney protecting the estate during that exact period. Why would she secretly sign a deal with Victor while helping Harold stop him? It didn't make sense. I called Helen directly. She answered almost immediately. "Sam, Helen, I need you to tell me something. What happened? Did you ever sign an agreement with Victor Hartman?" Silence. "Not long, but long enough." "No," she finally said. "Why would you ask that?" "Because I found a document with your name on it." Her voice became serious. "Where?" "At the farm. Don't touch it again." I frowned. "Why?" "Because if it is what I think it is, someone forged my signature." Relief mixed with suspicion. "Are you sure?" "Sam, I have spent 18 months protecting Harold's trust. I would never work against her wishes." She paused. "Send me a photograph of the document." I took several pictures and sent them. A few seconds later, my phone rang. "Sam, that's a forgery." "How do you know?" "The signature is close, but the notary stamp is wrong. More importantly, I wasn't in Oklahoma on the date shown." Earl looked at me and nodded slowly. "Then somebody wanted me to find it." "Exactly," Helen said. "And whoever planted that document knew enough about my work with Harold to make it believable." I felt a chill. "Victor, possibly. But don't assume. We need evidence." "Helen, someone called me and told me not to trust you." "Did they identify themselves?" "No," she exhaled. "Then listen carefully. From this moment on, don't meet anyone alone, don't sign anything, and don't give anyone the original documents." "What about Walter?" "Especially Walter." I looked at Earl. "He's already seen some of the evidence." "Then you need to move the originals somewhere secure." I remembered Harold's warning about copies. She had anticipated exactly this. "There are copies here," I said. "Good. Keep those. Take the originals to a secure location tomorrow." I nodded. Then Helen asked a question that surprised me. "Sam, did you open the blue folder?" "Yes." "Then you know about the trust." "I know Walter can't touch the farm." "Correct." Her voice softened. "Harold built that trust because she knew Walter was becoming reckless." She also included a provision I didn't expect her to use. "What provision?" "If Walter attempts to challenge the trust through fraud or enters into an unauthorized transaction with Victor, his inheritance can be forfeited." I looked toward the documents. "How much would he lose?" "Everything connected to the inheritance." I thought about the $5 million penthouse and the other assets Harold had left him. "Would you actually enforce it?" "If he crosses that line, yes." She paused. "And Sam, there's something else. Harold left instructions for me to contact federal authorities if the evidence showed financial fraud." I swallowed. "So Walter could go to prison." "If the evidence supports the charges, yes." The reality of it hit me. Walter wasn't just risking his inheritance. He was risking his freedom. I ended the call and sat down. Earl placed a hand on the table. "You okay?" "I don't know." I looked toward the farmhouse window. "He's still my son." Earl nodded. "And he still made his choices." I remembered Harold's final warning: protect yourself, protect the land. Then my phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from an unknown number. "You have until tomorrow morning to hand over the originals. After that, your son's problems become the least of your worries." I showed Earl. He read it twice. Then his expression changed. "Sam, we need to leave tonight." "Why?" He pointed at the message. "Because whoever sent this knows exactly where you are." And before I could answer, we heard a slow knock at the farmhouse door. 3 knocks. Then silence. The 3 knocks came again. Slow, deliberate, knock, knock, knock. Earl and I looked at each other without saying a word. The farmhouse suddenly felt far too small. I had spent my entire life believing home was the one place where a person could feel safe. But that night, with Harold's evidence scattered across the table and strangers outside, I realized safety wasn't a place anymore. It was something you had to protect. Earl motioned for me to stay behind him while he approached the door. He didn't open it. Instead, he looked through the small glass panel beside the frame. "Nobody," he whispered. I frowned. "What?" "There's nobody on the porch." I stepped closer. The wind moved through the trees, but the porch was empty. Then Earl pointed toward the floor. Something had been slipped beneath the door, a white envelope. My name was written across it. I didn't touch it. That's exactly what they want, Earl said. They want you curious. I nodded and called Helen. She answered on the second ring. Sam, someone left an envelope at the door. Her voice immediately became serious. Don't open it. Why? Because we don't know who left it. I looked at Earl. What should I do? Photograph it. Then put it somewhere safe. I took several pictures before carefully picking it up with a clean cloth. The envelope was heavier than it looked. There was something inside. I placed it on the table without opening it. Helen, I think someone is trying to scare me. They are. Who? Probably someone who knows you have the originals. I looked toward the canvas bag. Then what do they want? The evidence. She paused. But Sam, listen to me. You have something they don't. What? Harold's preparation. I didn't understand. She spent 2 years preparing for exactly this situation. Every document was copied. Every transaction was recorded. Every signature was compared. She knew Walter and Victor would eventually try to pressure you. I sat down slowly. Then why does everyone keep acting like the originals are so important? Because originals can be useful in court, but they're not your only protection. The copies are already documented, and I've secured additional copies with another attorney. Relief washed over me. So they can't destroy everything. Exactly. Helen's voice softened. But you still need to be careful. Earl suddenly pointed toward the window. I looked outside. A dark vehicle was parked near the far end of the property. It had no headlights. Helen, I whispered, there's someone outside. Do not go near them. I'm not. We watched the vehicle for nearly 5 minutes. Then it slowly turned around and disappeared down the road. I exhaled. They're watching me. Yes, Helen said, and that's why you need to leave before morning. Where? My office. Bring Earl if you trust him. Earl nodded. I'll go with you. I gathered the copied documents and placed them in a separate bag. Then I looked at the unopened envelope on the table. What about this? Helen thought for a moment. Bring it with you. Don't open it until you're with me, I agreed. Before ending the call, I asked the question that had been bothering me. Helen, did Harold ever tell you what she was most afraid of? There was silence. Yes. What? Helen answered quietly. That Walter would convince you that love meant obedience. The words struck me deeply. Harold had always understood the difference between loving someone and surrendering yourself to them. I picked up the bag. Earl checked the doors and windows. We were almost ready to leave when my phone buzzed. A message from Walter. Dad, please don't trust Earl. I stared at the screen. A second message arrived immediately. He isn't who Mom told you he was. I looked at Earl. He had his back turned toward me. For the first time, doubt entered my mind. Earl, he turned. Yes, I held up my phone. Why is Walter telling me not to trust you? Earl's expression didn't change. He simply sighed. Because Walter knows I was there when Harold discovered the first payment. What payment? Earl looked toward the floor. The payment Victor made to Walter. My heart stopped. You knew? Yes, and you never told me. Harold told me not to until you found the evidence yourself. I didn't know what to believe anymore. Then Earl reached into his jacket and pulled out a small photograph. There's something else Harold asked me to keep safe. He handed it to me. It showed Victor, Walter, and a third person standing together outside a bank. I recognized Victor. I recognized Walter. But the third person was someone I had trusted for months. And when I saw who it was, I realized the conspiracy reached much closer to my family than I had ever imagined. The third person in the photograph was Daniel Pierce, the same estate consultant Walter had brought into my house days earlier. I stared at the image, unable to understand how someone who had presented himself as a professional advisor could be standing beside Walter and Victor long before Harold died. You know him? I asked Earl. Yes, he said. Harold discovered his name while tracing the money. I looked at the photograph again. Daniel was standing between Walter and Victor, smiling as if the three men had just completed a business deal. Why would Walter bring him into my house? Earl's expression was grim. Because he needed someone who could make the paperwork look legitimate. My stomach tightened. Suddenly, the power of attorney documents made sense. Daniel hadn't appeared by accident. Walter had brought him there because the plan had already been prepared. Why didn't Harold tell me about him? I asked. Earl looked down. Because she didn't know how far the conspiracy went. She was still investigating when she became too sick. I felt a wave of sadness. Harold had been carrying all of this alone while I thought she was simply fighting her illness. I sat down at the kitchen table and spread the documents across it. The photograph, the forged agreements, the bank statements, the copies of emails. Everything seemed connected now. But one question remained. What did Daniel actually do? Earl pulled another document from his jacket. He prepared the guardianship paperwork. I stared at him. For me? Yes. Before Harold died. Months before. My hands went cold. I remembered Daniel standing in my kitchen, telling me that I needed someone to manage my finances because I was grieving. It had sounded reasonable at the time. Now I realized it had been rehearsed. Did Harold know? She found out 2 weeks before she died. Earl reached into the canvas bag and pulled out a handwritten note. She gave this to me. I unfolded it. Harold had written, "Daniel is not an independent consultant. He works for Victor." I closed my eyes. Another piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. Then why hasn't Daniel been arrested? Earl shook his head. Because Harold wanted you protected before anyone was confronted. She knew accusations without evidence could make things worse. I nodded. Harold had always believed in proof, not accusations, not emotional arguments, proof. I looked at the clock. It was nearly midnight. We needed to leave. But before I could stand, headlights appeared outside again. This time the vehicle stopped directly in front of the farmhouse. The driver's door opened. Daniel Pierce stepped out. He wasn't alone. 2 men followed him. "They're here for the documents," Earl whispered. My heart began pounding. Daniel walked toward the front door and knocked once. "Mr. Rutherford," he called. "I know you're inside." I didn't answer. "There's no reason to make this difficult," Earl whispered. "We need another exit." "There is one," I said. I remembered an old door in the pantry leading into the back garden. We moved quietly toward it, carrying the copies and leaving the original trunk upstairs. But before we reached the door, Daniel spoke again. "Sam, Walter doesn't want you hurt. Neither does Victor." I stopped. "Then tell them to leave me alone." Daniel's voice became colder. "That isn't possible anymore." Earl grabbed my arm. "Now." We slipped through the back door and moved into the darkness. The tall grass covered our footsteps as we made our way toward Earl's truck parked behind the barn. We were almost there when a flashlight swept across the field. "They're running," someone shouted. We crouched behind an old tractor until the light moved away. Then we ran. Earl started the engine and we sped down the dirt road without headlights. I looked back once. Daniel stood near the farmhouse watching us disappear. "Where are we going?" I asked. "Helen's office." "Why?" Earl looked at me. "Because there's one thing Harold never told you." "What?" "She didn't just prepare evidence against Walter and Victor." He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "She prepared evidence against everyone who helped them." I stared ahead, realizing this was no longer just about my son's betrayal. Harold had uncovered an entire network. And somewhere inside her final records was the name of the person who had made the whole scheme possible. The problem was, I still didn't know whose name I was about to find. Earl drove through the darkness with the headlights off for nearly a mile, before finally turning onto a narrow county road. I kept looking through the rear window, expecting to see Daniel's vehicle following us, but the road behind us remained empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't escaped anything. We had only bought ourselves time. "How far is Helen's office?" I asked. "About 40 minutes. Earl glanced at me. "But we're not going there yet." I frowned. "Why not?" Because if Daniel knows about the office, he'll expect us to go there. I thought about it. He was right. Daniel had already shown that he knew far too much. Then where? There's a place Harold used to keep documents. My heart tightened. Another hiding place, Earl nodded. She never told me everything about it. She only gave me the location and said I'd know when the time came. We drove another 20 minutes before turning onto a gravel road leading toward a small abandoned church. The building looked like it hadn't been used in years. Earl parked behind it and shut off the engine. Harold used to come here, I asked. Sometimes. We walked around the side of the building to a small storage shed. Earl pulled a key from his pocket and opened the door. Inside were old chairs, boxes, broken shelves, and a wooden cabinet. He moved 3 boxes aside and revealed a small metal safe attached to the wall. Harold gave me this key 6 months before she died. I stared at the safe. Why didn't you tell me about this earlier? Because she made me promise not to. He inserted the key and turned it. The safe opened. Inside was a thick black binder, a flash drive, and a sealed envelope. My name was written across it. I picked up the envelope. This is getting ridiculous. Earl almost smiled. Harold always liked being prepared. I opened it. The first sentence made me stop breathing. Sam, if you've reached this place, then someone has already tried to frighten you. I continued reading. Harold explained that she had discovered the conspiracy went beyond Walter and Victor. There were people inside the bank, a property company, and even a local legal office who had helped create false documents. She had recorded conversations and preserved copies of communications. But then came the name I hadn't expected. Daniel Pierce was only a middleman. The person coordinating the legal side of the operation was someone Harold had trusted for years. I read the name again. Robert Hayes. My heart sank. Robert had been Harold's financial advisor for more than a decade. He had helped us manage investments, prepare taxes, and organize our estate. I had spoken to him just days after Harold died. He had even expressed sympathy at the funeral. Robert, Earl nodded. Harold suspected him. Why? Because money started moving through accounts connected to his firm. I opened the black binder. Inside were transaction records showing payments from Victor's company to an account associated with Robert. The dates matched meetings Robert had held with Harold. I felt betrayed all over again. How many people had been standing around my family pretending to care while secretly waiting for Harold to die? Then I found something even more disturbing. A printed email from Robert to Victor contained a sentence that made my hands tremble. Once the husband is isolated, Walter can finish the transfer. Husband, me. They had been discussing me like I was an obstacle between them and the land. Earl watched as I read the document. There's more, he said. I turned the page. Another document listed several payments. One of them was marked $75,000, initial coordination fee. Another showed $150,000, guardianship preparation. The final payment was labeled $500,000, successful property transfer. I stared at the numbers. Walter hadn't been acting alone. He had been surrounded by people who were financially invested in my downfall. Suddenly, the flash drive on the table caught my attention. What's on that? Earl shook his head. Harold never told me. I picked it up. Then we're going to find out. We returned to the truck and used my laptop to open the files. There were dozens of recordings. I clicked the first one. Static filled the speakers. Then I heard Walter's voice. My father will sign eventually. A second voice answered. It was Robert. And if he doesn't, Walter replied, then we'll make sure he has no choice. I stopped the recording. Earl looked at me. Neither of us spoke. Then another recording started automatically. This time I heard Harold's voice. She sounded weak but determined. If you're listening to this, Sam, it means they failed. I stared at the screen. Harold continued, but there's one final truth you must know before you decide what to do with our son. Her voice became softer. Walter didn't start this. I froze. If Walter hadn't started the plan, then who had? The recording ended with Harold's voice hanging in the silence of the truck. Walter didn't start this. I stared at the laptop screen, unable to process what I had just heard. For the past several days, I had believed my son was the architect of everything that had happened. He had lied to me, stolen from us, and worked with Victor. But Harold's words suggested something much deeper. "Play the rest," I whispered. Earl clicked the recording again. Harold's voice returned, weaker this time. Walter was approached first. He was told about the farm's potential and offered money. He was promised a future he believed he could never build on his own. But the person who approached him wasn't Victor. I leaned closer to the screen. Harold paused for several seconds before continuing. The person who convinced Walter to betray his family was someone Walter trusted completely. The recording crackled. Then Harold said a name. "Robert Hayes." My heart dropped. "So Robert recruited Walter?" I asked. Earl nodded slowly. "That's what Harold believed." I played the recording again. Harold explained that Robert had known about the farm's geological reports because he had helped manage some of Harold's financial affairs. He discovered the land might contain valuable reserves and realized that the family had no idea how much the property could eventually be worth. Robert then contacted Victor. Together, they approached Walter. They convinced him that I would never agree to sell the farm voluntarily, and that the only way to obtain control was through legal manipulation. Walter, according to Harold, initially resisted. He apparently told Robert he didn't want to hurt me, but Robert knew exactly how to manipulate him. He promised Walter millions of dollars and told him that I was too old to understand the opportunity. Walter became greedy, Harold said, but he was also frightened. Robert made him believe that if he refused, someone else would take the opportunity away. I stopped the recording. He still chose to do it. Earl nodded. "Yes." I started the recording again. Harold's voice became more emotional. "Sam, I don't want you to excuse Walter. What he did was wrong. But I want you to understand that he wasn't the mastermind." I looked down at my hands. That distinction didn't erase the betrayal. It simply made it more complicated. Harold continued, "The person behind the plan is Robert. He has been moving money, creating false documents, and coordinating with Victor for years." Then she said something that made my stomach tighten. "And there is evidence that Robert intended to eliminate the final obstacle." I froze. "What does that mean?" Earl asked. I didn't answer. Harold continued speaking. "If Robert cannot obtain control of the property legally, he may try to create a situation where Sam is declared incapable of managing his affairs. If that fails, I fear he may try something more dangerous." The recording ended abruptly. I sat motionless. Earl reached over and closed the laptop. "We need to get somewhere safe." "Not yet." "Sam, you heard what Harold said." "I know." I looked at the flash drive. "But there has to be more." We opened the remaining files. One folder was labeled Robert. Inside were dozens of scanned documents, emails, and financial records. One email from Robert to Victor stood out. It was dated just 3 weeks before Harold's death. The message contained only one sentence. "Her condition is worsening. We should be ready to move when she is gone." I felt sick. They had been waiting for Harold to die. Then I noticed another file created 2 days before her death. The title was simply Transfer Plan Final Version. I opened it. The document outlined exactly how they planned to take control of the farm. First, pressure me into signing power of attorney. Second, move me into assisted living. Third, challenge the trust. Fourth, transfer the mineral rights. But there was one final step highlighted in red. If subject refuses cooperation, initiate emergency incapacity proceedings. I stared at those words. "Subject," I whispered. They didn't even see me as a person. Earl looked toward the church window. "Sam, there's something else." "What?" He pointed at the final file on the flash drive. It had been created only 12 hours earlier. "Someone is still adding documents." I opened it. The newest file contained a photograph of me sitting at the farmhouse table earlier that evening. It had been taken through the window. Under the photograph was a message. "We know where you are." I looked at Earl, my pulse racing. Then another file appeared on the screen automatically. It contained only one sentence. "Come to the courthouse at 9 tomorrow morning, or your son goes to prison." The message on the screen left me staring at the laptop in disbelief. "Come to the courthouse at 9 tomorrow morning, or your son goes to prison." It was exactly the kind of threat Robert would make if he believed fear could still control me. But something about the message bothered me. If Robert truly had enough evidence to put Walter in prison, why threaten me? Why not simply hand everything to the authorities? The answer became obvious. He needed me to do something. He needed me to walk into the courthouse and make a mistake. "They're trying to bait you," Earl said. I nodded. "I know." "Then don't go." I looked at him. "If I don't, Walter could still be in danger." Earl sighed. "Sam, your son put himself in this situation." I knew he was right, but he was still my son. No matter what Walter had done, I couldn't simply abandon him. I closed the laptop and called Helen. She answered immediately. "Sam, where are you?" "At the old church." "Good, stay there." I told her about the message. She became silent. "Helen, don't go to the courthouse alone." "I wasn't planning to." "Sam, listen carefully. Robert is trying to force you into making a public statement before we can secure the evidence. Can he really put Walter in prison? Possibly. But if the evidence proves Walter was manipulated and cooperates with investigators, his situation could be different." I looked at Earl. "Then what should I do?" "Go to the courthouse." I frowned. "You just told me not to go alone." "Exactly. You won't be alone. I'll meet you there with another attorney." "What about the threat?" "Bring it. Don't delete anything. Don't respond to Robert." Her confidence gave me a small sense of control. "Helen, there's something you need to know. We found recordings." "Of Robert?" "Yes." "Harold recorded everything." Helen inhaled sharply. "Then you have enough to change the entire case." "There's more. Robert knew about Harold's condition before she died." "I suspected that. He was waiting for her to die." Helen's voice became colder. "Sam, tomorrow morning may be the most important morning of your life." We agreed to meet at 8:30. After ending the call, I looked at Earl. "You heard everything." He nodded. "Then let's get some sleep." But neither of us slept much. Around 3 in the morning, I heard the sound of tires on gravel. I immediately sat up. Earl was already awake. We turned off the lights and watched through a narrow window. A dark pickup truck had stopped near the church. No one got out. After several minutes, the truck drove away. "They're watching us," Earl whispered. "Yes." I picked up the flash drive. "Then we need to protect this." Earl looked at me. "Where?" I thought about Harold's instructions. She had hidden copies everywhere because she knew someone might come searching. I removed the flash drive from the laptop and placed it inside the lining of my jacket. The original documents went into a sealed envelope. The copies stayed in the canvas bag. At 7, we left the church. Earl drove while I called Helen again. She told us to use a different route to the courthouse. When we arrived, the parking lot was already crowded. I spotted Helen standing beside a gray sedan with another attorney. She waved us over. "Sam, this is Laura Bennett." Laura shook my hand. "I've reviewed what Helen sent me. You have serious evidence." I handed her the envelope containing Robert's threat. She read it carefully. "This is useful." "Useful?" I asked. "It's evidence of coercion." Before we could say anything else, a black SUV pulled into the lot. Walter stepped out. He looked exhausted. His clothes were wrinkled and he hadn't shaved. He walked toward me slowly. "Dad," I stared at him. "Why are you here?" "Because Robert contacted me last night." My heart tightened. "What did he say?" Walter looked toward the courthouse doors. "He told me if I don't convince you to surrender the farm, he'll release documents that will make it look like I planned everything." I shook my head. "You did plan part of it." "I know." He lowered his eyes. "But Dad, Robert has been manipulating everything from the beginning." Then Walter reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "I stole this from Robert's office last night." Helen stepped closer. "What's inside?" Walter looked at me. "The original contract between Robert and Victor." He handed it to me. I opened the envelope and saw the signatures. Then I saw the date. My blood ran cold. The agreement had been signed before Walter ever met Victor. Walter hadn't started the conspiracy. Robert had. But beneath Robert's signature was another name, one that none of us had expected. And that signature proved the scheme began years earlier than Harold ever realized. The signature beneath Robert Hayes's name belonged to someone I had never expected to see connected to the conspiracy. Morrison Energy's regional director, Charles Whitmore. I stared at the document while Helen leaned closer to examine it. "That's impossible," she whispered. "Why?" I asked. "Because Charles Whitmore officially left Morrison Energy 3 years ago." Laura took the contract from my hands and studied the final page. "If this is authentic, then this agreement predates the geological survey that supposedly made the farm valuable." Walter nodded. "That's what I found in Robert's office." I looked at him. "How did you get this?" He hesitated. "I went there last night." Helen's expression hardened. "You broke into Robert's office." "I didn't know what else to do." "Walter, you may have destroyed evidence." "I know," he said quietly, "but I found this before anyone could stop me." He handed Laura another document. It was an old internal memorandum from Morrison Energy. The date was nearly 4 years earlier. The memo discussed the Rutherford property and recommended obtaining control of the mineral rights before the landowners discovered its potential. My chest tightened. 4 years, I whispered. "Harold didn't even know about the oil then." Laura nodded. "Apparently someone did." Helen looked at Walter. "When did Robert first approach you?" Walter stared at the ground. "About 2 years ago. Then Robert was already working on this before you became involved." Walter nodded. "He told me the farm would eventually make millions. He said Dad would never know what it was worth because Harold kept everything complicated." I felt anger rise again. "He used you." Walter swallowed. "Yes. And you let him." "Yes." For the first time, Walter didn't defend himself. He simply admitted it. That didn't erase what he had done, but it made the truth easier to see. Robert had found my son's weakness and used it. Victor had provided the money. Daniel had handled the paperwork. And someone inside Morrison Energy had apparently been preparing the operation years before. But why would a company target one old farm so aggressively? Laura pointed at the contract. "There's something else here." She turned the page and showed me a paragraph I hadn't noticed. It referred to a regional development corridor that included several neighboring properties. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means the farm may be part of something larger," she explained. "If Morrison or another company controls enough adjoining mineral rights, they could potentially develop a much larger field." Earl suddenly spoke. "That explains Harold's notes." We all looked at him. "What notes?" I asked. Earl reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded map. He spread it across the hood of the car. Several properties were marked in red. My farm sat in the center. Harold discovered that at least 7 surrounding properties had already changed ownership. I stared at the map. 7, all within 18 months. Laura studied the addresses. "Who bought them?" Earl pointed toward the documents. "Different companies." Laura shook her head. "Different names, same registered agent." Helen looked at her. "Who?" Laura checked the paperwork again. Her expression changed. "Robert Hayes." Silence fell over us. Robert wasn't simply trying to steal my farm. He had been quietly assembling an entire region. My property was the final piece. Then my phone vibrated. An unknown number. I almost ignored it, but the message appeared before I could. "You have no idea what you've uncovered. Leave the courthouse now." A second message arrived immediately. "Look at the man standing beside you." I slowly lifted my eyes. Helen was beside me. Laura stood on my other side. Earl was near the truck. Walter stood several feet away. None of them moved. Then another message appeared. "One of them is working for Robert." My heart began racing. I looked at every face around me, suddenly wondering who had betrayed Harold. Walter noticed my expression. "Dad, what happened?" I couldn't answer. Helen stepped closer. "Sam," I looked down at the phone again. The final message contained only 4 words: "Trust nobody, not even Helen." I felt the ground shift beneath me. The courthouse doors opened behind us and a man in a dark suit walked outside. He looked directly at me. I recognized him immediately. Charles Whitmore, the former Morrison Energy executive whose signature appeared on the original agreement. But he wasn't alone. Standing beside him was Robert Hayes, and Robert was smiling. Robert Hayes stood outside the courthouse beside Charles Whitmore, wearing the same calm expression I had seen across my kitchen table. But now, I understood what that calmness meant. Robert wasn't surprised to see me. He had expected me to come. Charles looked older than I imagined, with silver hair and an expensive dark suit, but there was something cold in his eyes that made me uneasy. Helen stepped slightly in front of me. "Robert," she said firmly, "you need to leave." Robert smiled. "Helen, you're still protecting Harold's husband. Admirable, but unnecessary." Laura moved beside Helen. "We've reviewed enough documents to know you're facing serious questions." Robert's smile disappeared. "Questions aren't evidence." I held up the original contract Walter had stolen from his office. "Then maybe this is." For the first time, Robert looked nervous. Charles Whitmore glanced at the document and then at Robert. "You told me he didn't have the original." Robert's eyes narrowed. "I said he shouldn't have it." That sentence confirmed everything. Robert had been lying to Charles too. Walter stepped forward. "You used me." Robert looked at him with disgust. "You made your own choices." Walter shook his head. "You promised me $5 million. And you agreed. You told me my father would never understand the value of the land." Robert shrugged. "I was right." I felt something inside me snap. "You underestimated me." Robert finally looked directly at me. "No, Sam, Harold underestimated how much you would resist." I stared at him. "Don't mention my wife." His expression remained cold. "Harold was clever, but she was emotional. She believed protecting you meant hiding the truth. That gave us time." Helen stepped forward. "You made one mistake." Robert raised an eyebrow. "Which was?" "You left a trail." Laura immediately added, "And you've just admitted enough in front of witnesses to make that trail much more valuable." Charles suddenly stepped away from Robert. "I'm not part of this anymore." Robert turned sharply. "Charles, don't." Charles shook his head. "You told me this was a legitimate acquisition strategy. You never said anything about forged documents or guardianship." Robert's expression hardened. "You signed the original agreement. I signed a preliminary memorandum. You signed it knowing what it meant." Charles looked at me. "Mr. Rutherford, I didn't know about the fraudulent part." Laura stepped toward him. "Then you should cooperate with investigators." Charles hesitated. Robert laughed quietly. "Do you really think cooperation will save you?" Charles looked frightened. That was when I realized Robert was losing control. He had spent years making other people afraid, but now his own network was beginning to collapse. Helen touched my arm. "Sam, we need to go inside." We entered the courthouse together. Walter followed behind us. The hallway was crowded, but I barely noticed anyone. All I could think about was Harold. She had spent her final months gathering evidence, knowing that one day I might have to stand in a place like this and defend everything she had left me. Inside a private conference room, Laura connected the flash drive to her laptop. The recordings played one after another. Robert's voice, Walter's voice, Victor's voice, Daniel's voice. Every conversation revealed another piece of the conspiracy. Then Laura opened the newest file. It was an audio recording dated 3 days before Harold died. Harold's voice came through the speakers, weak but clear. "I know what Robert is planning. I know what Victor wants. And I know Walter has already crossed a line he may never be able to undo." I closed my eyes. Then Harold said something that none of us expected. "But there is one person Robert doesn't know about." Laura paused the recording. "Who?" I asked. She looked at the file name. "Harold's recording doesn't say." Then she played the final seconds. Harold whispered, "If anything happens to me, contact the person who bought the farm in 1979. I opened my eyes. "What does that mean?" Earl suddenly went pale. "Sam, what?" He pointed at the date. "Harold's father bought the farm in 1979. I stared at him. "So who could have bought it?" Earl shook his head. "That's impossible." But Helen was already searching through the old property records. Then she stopped. Her face went completely white. "Sam," she whispered, "the farm wasn't originally purchased by Harold's father." She turned the screen toward me. "It was purchased by someone else. And the name on the original deed belonged to a person who could completely change who legally owned the mineral rights beneath the farm. The name on the original deed was Alina Rutherford, my grandmother." I stared at the document, confused. "That can't be right," I said. "My grandfather bought this farm." Helen shook her head. "He inherited it, but he didn't originally purchase it." Laura leaned over the screen. "Look at the transfer history." I followed the dates carefully. Alina had purchased the property in 1979 and transferred it to her son several years later. But there was something unusual about the original deed. The mineral rights had not been transferred with the surface property. They had been retained separately. My heart began pounding. "So the land above ground belongs to me, but the minerals underneath may belong to someone else." Laura nodded. "That's what this document suggests." Robert's entire plan suddenly made sense. If he could convince me to sell the surface property without understanding the mineral rights, he could potentially control the most valuable part of the estate through another agreement. Helen searched through the county records while Earl stood silently behind us. Then she found another document. It was an old mineral rights reservation filed in 1979. The original owner had retained a 50% interest in all future mineral production. I stared at the signature. "Alina," Helen nodded. "Your grandmother kept half." "What happened to the other half?" Laura searched the transfer records. "That's the problem. It changed hands several times." She opened another record. The remaining interest had eventually been transferred to a company called Rutherford Holdings. I had never heard of it. "Who owns that company?" I asked. Laura entered the registration number into the database. A few seconds later she froze. "Sam, what?" "Rutherford Holdings is inactive." "So who owns the mineral rights?" She scrolled further. "That's what we're trying to determine." Suddenly the conference room door opened. A courthouse employee stepped inside and handed Helen a sealed envelope. "This was delivered for Mr. Rutherford." Helen looked at me. "Who brought it?" "A courier." "From whom?" "He didn't say." I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a photocopy of a 1979 agreement and a handwritten note. "Your grandmother knew the mineral rights would become valuable. She also knew someone would eventually try to steal them." Beneath the note was another name, Samuel Rutherford. "My own grandfather." I looked at Earl. "My grandfather knew." Earl nodded slowly. "Harold suspected he did." "Then why didn't anyone tell me?" "Because the records were buried for decades." Laura examined the agreement. "This is more important than the drilling contract." She pointed to a clause near the bottom. "Read this." I did. It stated that if the mineral rights were ever developed, the original family trust would receive a percentage of the revenue. I felt a strange mixture of shock and relief. The farm wasn't simply worth millions because of oil. My family had deliberately protected its future value decades earlier. Then Helen found something else. "Sam, there's a transfer here from 1998. She enlarged the document. "Someone attempted to move the mineral rights into a private company." "Who?" I asked. She looked at the signature. "Robert Hayes." My stomach dropped. Robert had been involved much longer than I realized. He hadn't discovered the opportunity recently. He had been tracking these rights for years. "How could Robert transfer something he didn't own?" I asked. Laura answered, "He couldn't. But if he created a false chain of title, he could make it look legitimate to a buyer who didn't investigate deeply." I thought about Victor's company. "So they planned to use the fake records to convince the drilling company they owned everything." "Exactly." Walter suddenly spoke from the corner. "That's what Robert told me." I turned toward him. "You knew about the mineral rights." He looked ashamed. "I knew there was something valuable under the farm. I didn't know about the old reservation. And you still tried to sell it." "Yes," his voice cracked. "I was wrong." For the first time I believed he meant it, but before I could respond, Helen's phone rang. She listened for several seconds, then her expression changed. "Sam, we have a problem." "What?" She lowered the phone. "The county just received an emergency filing." "From who?" "Robert." Laura stood up. "What is he claiming?" Helen looked at me. "He's claiming that you are mentally incapable of managing the property and that the farm should be placed under temporary court control." I felt the blood drain from my face. The plan Harold had feared was happening exactly as she predicted. But then Helen smiled faintly. "There's one thing Robert doesn't know." "What?" She held up the old 1979 agreement. "Your grandmother included a clause that makes his entire petition almost impossible to enforce." I stared at her. "What clause?" Helen looked toward Walter. "A clause requiring every future owner of the property to prove they understand the mineral rights reservation." She paused. "And Robert just filed a petition based on a property description that ignores those rights completely." Laura smiled. "Which means he may have just proven his own fraud." But before we could celebrate, the courthouse doors suddenly opened. A federal investigator walked into the room holding a photograph of Robert. He looked at me and said, "Mr. Rutherford, we need to talk about what your wife discovered before she died." The federal investigator's words stopped me cold. "We need to talk about what your wife discovered before she died." I looked at Helen, then at Laura, and finally at Walter. Nobody spoke. The investigator introduced himself as Agent Thomas Reed and placed a thin folder on the table. "Mr. Rutherford, we've been reviewing financial activity connected to Robert Hayes and Victor Hartman. Your wife's records came up repeatedly." I swallowed. "Harold knew you were investigating." "Not directly. She was communicating with another investigator through her attorney." Helen nodded. "That was me." Agent Reed opened the folder. "Your wife reported suspicious transfers and possible fraud involving several companies connected to the farm. She also provided copies of documents that suggested an attempt to manipulate the mineral rights records." I looked at the papers. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Reed looked at Helen. "Because Harold specifically requested that you not be informed until there was enough evidence to protect you." That answer hurt, but I understood it. Harold had been trying to shield me from something far larger than a family dispute. Reed continued, "We've been watching Robert for several months, but we couldn't move forward without corroborating evidence." He looked at the flash drive sitting on the table. "You may have just provided it." I handed him the drive. "These are recordings Harold made." He carefully placed it inside an evidence bag. "This could be extremely important." Walter stepped forward. "Agent Reed, I need to tell you something." Reed looked at him. "Go ahead." Walter admitted everything. He explained how Robert had approached him, how Victor promised him millions, and how Daniel helped prepare the guardianship documents. He admitted stealing money and participating in the attempt to gain control of the farm. I listened quietly. Hearing my son confess was painful, but there was something different in his voice now. He wasn't making excuses. He was finally telling the truth. Reed asked, "Did Robert ever threaten you?" Walter nodded. "Several times." "Do you have proof?" Walter pulled out his phone. "I recorded one conversation." Reed looked surprised. "Play it." Walter pressed the recording. Robert's voice filled the room. "If your father doesn't cooperate, you will lose everything." Walter answered, "I can't force him." Robert replied, "Then we'll make him incapable of refusing." The room went silent. Agent Reed looked at me. "Mr. Rutherford, this recording may establish intent." He turned toward Walter. "You understand that cooperating doesn't erase your own conduct?" Walter nodded. "I know." Reed looked back at me. "But cooperation can be considered." I looked at my son. For the first time, I saw not the man who had betrayed me, but the frightened boy Harold and I had raised. He had made terrible choices, but perhaps he still had a chance to make one good one. Then Reed opened another folder. There's something else. He placed a photograph on the table. It showed Robert meeting someone outside a bank. I recognized the building immediately. That's where my grandfather kept his original records, I said. Reed nodded. Exactly. He pointed to the second person in the photograph. This man is Charles Whitmore. Why were they meeting there? Reed asked. We believe they were discussing the original mineral rights reservation. Helen leaned closer. When was this taken? Reed answered. 6 years ago. I stared at the image. Robert had been pursuing the mineral rights years before Harold discovered anything. But there was one detail that made my heart stop. In the background of the photograph was a third person walking toward the bank entrance. Reed enlarged the image. The face became clearer. It was someone I recognized immediately. My older brother, Daniel Rutherford. I felt the room spin. That's impossible, I whispered. My brother had died 15 years earlier. Agent Reed looked at me carefully. Are you certain? Yes. He turned the photograph around. Then we have a problem. I stared at the date again. The photograph was recent. My brother was supposedly dead. Yet there he was, walking into the bank with Robert and Charles. And suddenly, I realized Harold's final secret wasn't just about the farm. It was about someone in my family who may have been alive all along. The room seemed to shrink around me. I couldn't take my eyes off the photograph. The man walking into the bank looked exactly like my older brother Daniel. The same narrow face, the same silver hair, the same slight bend in his left shoulder. But Daniel had died 15 years ago. I had stood beside his grave. I had watched the coffin lowered into the ground. There was no way he could be the man in that photograph. Could the date be wrong? I asked. Agent Reed shook his head. We verified the timestamp. Helen leaned toward the photograph. Sam, are you absolutely certain about the identification? I would know my brother anywhere. Reed placed another photograph beside the first. It showed the same man leaving the bank. Then he placed a third image on the table. This one was clearer. The man turned toward the camera. My hands began trembling. That's Daniel. Walter stepped closer. Dad, are you sure? I nodded. Completely. Reed looked serious. Then we need to understand what happened 15 years ago. I told him everything I remembered. Daniel had been 48 when he supposedly died. He had been working for a construction company in another state. According to the official story, his car had gone off a mountain road during a storm. The vehicle was destroyed by fire, and identification had supposedly been made through personal belongings. There had never been a proper visual identification. I had never questioned it because the grief was overwhelming. Harold had handled most of the paperwork. Now, 15 years later, that old tragedy suddenly looked different. Was there an insurance policy? Reed asked. I nodded slowly. There was a life insurance payment. How much? I don't remember exactly. Helen looked at me. I do. She opened a file on her laptop. It was nearly $800,000. My heart stopped. Where did that money go? Most of it was placed into a family investment account. Reed looked at the records. And that account was later managed by Robert Hayes. Nobody spoke. I felt sick. Robert had been connected to my family's finances for years. If Daniel had somehow survived, then the entire story surrounding his death could have been fabricated. But why? And why would Daniel cooperate with Robert? Agent Reed asked Helen to retrieve the original insurance records. She searched through archived files while Laura examined the photographs. Then Helen suddenly froze. Sam. What? The insurance beneficiary wasn't Harold. Who was it? She turned the screen toward me. The beneficiary was listed as Daniel Rutherford's business partner. I stared at the name. I recognized it immediately. Charles Whitmore. Reed's expression changed. The same Charles Whitmore connected to Morrison Energy. Helen nodded. And the same man standing beside Robert in these photographs. Everything became darker. Daniel's supposed death had created an enormous insurance payment. That money had moved through Robert's financial network. Years later, Robert became involved with the farm's mineral rights. Could Daniel have staged his death to disappear with Whitmore's help? Could he have been involved from the beginning? I didn't want to believe it. Maybe the man in the photograph isn't Daniel, I said, almost desperately. Reed looked at me. We can test that. How? We can compare the photograph with verified photographs of your brother using facial recognition analysis and other investigative methods. But we need more. He looked at the old records. Do you have anything belonging to Daniel? I thought for a moment. Harold kept a box of his things. Where? In the farmhouse attic, Earl suddenly spoke. Then we need to go back. I looked at him. The farmhouse had become the center of everything. Harold's documents were there. The original deed was there, and now possibly something belonging to Daniel. But before we could leave, Agent Reed received a phone call. He listened for several seconds. His expression became grim. "What's wrong?" I asked. He lowered the phone. "Robert just left his office." "Where is he going?" "We don't know yet." Then another call came in. Reed answered it. His face changed again. "They found a vehicle abandoned near the old Rutherford property." My heart sank. "Whose vehicle?" Reed looked directly at me. "Robert Hayes's." He paused. "And inside the vehicle, investigators found a photograph of your brother Daniel." I felt a chill run through me. "Alive?" Reed shook his head. "No, the photograph was old." He turned the picture toward me. Daniel was standing beside Harold and my grandfather. But on the back, Harold had written a date and one sentence. "Daniel knows why the farm was always worth protecting." And suddenly, I understood that finding my brother might not reveal the past. It might reveal the reason everyone was still fighting to control the farm today. The photograph stayed in my hands as Agent Reed explained that investigators had found it inside Robert Hayes's abandoned vehicle. I couldn't stop staring at the image of Harold, my grandfather, and my supposedly dead brother Daniel standing together beside the farmhouse decades earlier. On the back, Harold had written only one sentence. "Daniel knows why the farm was always worth protecting." "We need to go back to the farmhouse," I said. Reed immediately shook his head. "Not yet. The property may be under surveillance. But whatever Harold wanted me to find could still be there. Then we'll search it properly." Laura gathered the documents while Helen secured the copies. Walter stood silently near the window. He looked completely defeated. I turned toward him. "Did you know Daniel might be alive?" Walter shook his head. "No. Did Robert ever mention him?" Walter hesitated. "Once." Everyone looked at him. "When?" "About a year ago. Robert asked whether I remembered Uncle Daniel." My heart tightened. "What exactly did he say?" Walter swallowed. "He asked if Mom had ever told me why Daniel disappeared." "And what did you say?" "I said Daniel was dead." Walter looked at me. Robert smiled and said, "That's what everyone believes." The room became silent. I felt a cold sensation move through my body. If Walter was telling the truth, Robert had known Daniel's death wasn't what it appeared to be. Agent Reed immediately wrote something down. "That's important." We left the courthouse under federal escort. The drive back toward the farm felt completely different. I wasn't returning simply to uncover Harold's secrets anymore. I was returning to find the missing piece of my family's history. When we arrived, investigators had already secured the property. The farmhouse stood exactly as I'd left it, but now yellow evidence markers surrounded the entrance. Reed led us inside. "We'll search the attic first." We climbed the stairs and reached the room where Harold's trunk had been hidden. I looked around slowly. Everything seemed untouched. Then I remembered something Harold used to say whenever I asked why she kept old family belongings. "Some things aren't valuable until you know their story." I walked toward an old wooden chest near the wall. It had belonged to my grandfather. I had never opened it because Harold always kept it locked. Reed examined the lock. "Do you have a key?" I searched my pockets and found a small brass key attached to my old key ring. I had carried it for years without knowing what it opened. I inserted it. The lock clicked. Inside were old photographs, letters, property records, and a leather notebook. I picked up the notebook. The first page contained my grandfather's handwriting. 1979. Eleanor has completed the purchase. The mineral rights remain with the family. My heart raced. Page after page described the farm's history. But then I reached an entry dated 1987. Daniel discovered what lies beneath the eastern field. I looked at Reed. What does that mean? He pointed toward the notebook. Keep reading. The next entry explained that Daniel had discovered geological reports suggesting the farm was part of a much larger underground formation. My grandfather believed the land could eventually become extremely valuable. But he also feared corporations would try to acquire it cheaply. He wrote that Daniel had been approached by an energy company and offered money for information. Daniel refused. Then came the final entry. Daniel has disappeared. We believe someone is trying to make it appear that he is dead. My hands began shaking. This was written before the accident. Reed nodded. Which means your family suspected the death was staged. I turned another page. There was a photograph of Daniel standing beside a younger Robert Hayes. On the back, my grandfather had written, "Never trust Robert." Then I found an envelope hidden inside the notebook. It was addressed to Harold. I opened it carefully. Inside was a short letter from Daniel. The first sentence made my heart stop. "Harold, if you receive this, it means I failed to disappear completely." I read on. Daniel claimed he had gone into hiding because he discovered Robert was working with people who wanted control of the mineral rights. He had survived the staged accident and spent years secretly gathering evidence. But the final paragraph was the most shocking. "The man you know as Robert Hayes is not working alone. The person funding everything is someone our family trusted." I looked at Helen. She seemed as shocked as I was. Then I turned the letter over. On the back was a phone number and a name, Daniel Rutherford. Before I could call it, my phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number. I answered cautiously. A familiar voice whispered, "Sam, it's Daniel, your brother." "Sam, it's Daniel, your brother." I couldn't speak. For 15 years I had believed Daniel was dead, and now his voice was coming through my phone. It sounded older, rougher, but unmistakably familiar. "Daniel," I finally whispered. "Yes." My knees nearly gave out. I grabbed the edge of the wooden chest while everyone in the room stared at me. Agent Reed immediately moved closer. "Put the call on speaker," he whispered. I did. Daniel was silent for several seconds. Then he said, "I know you have questions." "Questions?" My voice cracked. "Daniel, I've spent 15 years believing you were dead." "I know. Why didn't you come home?" He exhaled slowly. "Because coming home would have put you and Harold in danger." I looked at Helen. She was already crying quietly. "Mom knew?" I asked. "Yes." Daniel's answer hit me harder than anything else. "She knew you were alive. She knew I survived the accident. She didn't know where I was for most of those years." I closed my eyes. Everything I thought I knew about my family was collapsing. Daniel explained that the accident had been staged after he discovered that Robert Hayes and several executives were attempting to acquire the mineral rights beneath our family property. He had confronted them, and soon afterward, his car had been found destroyed. Daniel escaped and disappeared. "I wanted to contact you," he said, "but Robert had people watching the family." "Why did you let me mourn you?" I asked. "Because I thought my death would keep you safe." His voice became emotional. "I was wrong." Agent Reed motioned for me to keep him talking. "Where are you now?" I asked. "Somewhere Robert can't easily find me." "Are you safe?" For the moment, I swallowed. "Daniel, Robert is here. He's been trying to take the farm." "I know." "How?" "Because I've been watching him." I stared at the phone. "You've been watching us." "From a distance." Then Daniel said something that changed everything. "Sam, Robert isn't trying to steal the farm because of the oil." I frowned. "Then why?" Because of what's beneath it. Agent Reed leaned closer. What exactly is beneath the property? Daniel paused. Not just oil. There's an underground geological formation containing something far more valuable. What? A rare mineral deposit. My heart pounded. How valuable? Potentially worth hundreds of millions. Everyone in the room went silent. Daniel continued, but that's not the biggest secret. Then what is? The deposit extends beneath several properties Robert has already acquired. Your farm sits directly over the largest section. Suddenly, the 7 surrounding properties made sense. Robert had been buying the entire region because he wanted to control the formation. Why didn't you tell the government? Agent Reed asked. Daniel was silent. Because I didn't trust anyone. Reed looked at me. I understood. If Robert had people inside banks, companies, and legal offices, Daniel couldn't know who was safe. Daniel, I said, Harold left evidence. I know. She told me to find you. She knew I'd eventually contact you. His voice softened. She was always smarter than both of us. I smiled sadly. She missed you. I know. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel said, Sam, there's something you need to understand about Robert. What? He doesn't know that you have the original mineral rights agreement. I looked at the old notebook. How do you know? Because I was the one who hid it. My eyes widened. You? Yes. Before I disappeared, I made a copy of the original agreement and gave it to Harold. She kept it hidden for years. Helen suddenly stepped forward. Daniel, where is the original? That's the problem. His voice became urgent. Robert found out it still exists. How? Someone inside Harold's legal network told him. I looked at Helen. Daniel continued, Sam, don't trust anyone who had access to Harold's estate records. The room went silent. Then Daniel added, and there's one more thing. What? The person who gave Robert the information wasn't Helen. Relief briefly crossed my face. Then who was it? Daniel hesitated. I don't know his real name, but I know the identity he used. Who? Daniel's voice dropped to a whisper. Your grandfather's old business partner. I froze. He's been dead for 20 years. Daniel answered, No, Sam, he's alive. And before the call ended, Daniel gave me an address, the place where he believed that man was hiding. It was less than 10 miles from my farm. The address Daniel gave me was less than 10 miles from the farm, but it felt like we were driving into another world. Earl drove while Agent Reed followed behind us in an unmarked vehicle. Helen and Laura stayed back at the courthouse to handle the legal filings, but before we left, Helen gave me one final warning. Sam, don't confront anyone until Agent Reed says it's safe. I promised, although I knew that promise might be difficult to keep. My mind was still trying to understand Daniel's revelation. The man we were looking for was supposedly dead, yet Daniel insisted he was alive. If that was true, then someone had spent decades hiding the truth from my family. We turned onto a narrow road surrounded by thick trees and stopped in front of an old farmhouse. The property looked abandoned. The windows were covered with wooden boards, weeds surrounded the porch, and an old pickup truck sat beneath a rusted metal shelter. Agent Reed stepped out first. Stay behind me. We approached the house carefully. The front door was unlocked. Inside, dust covered nearly every surface, but there were signs someone had been living there recently. A coffee cup sat beside the sink. Fresh footprints crossed the kitchen floor. Reed immediately raised his hand. Someone was here. We searched the rooms carefully until Earl noticed a photograph hanging crookedly on the wall. He removed it and found a small metal compartment behind it. Inside was a key and a handwritten note. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It belonged to my grandfather. The note contained only an address. It was the same address Daniel had given us. We're in the right place, Reed said. He took the key and opened a locked cabinet in the hallway. Inside were dozens of old financial records, property documents, and photographs. One photograph showed my grandfather standing beside another man. I recognized him from the family albums. Thomas Mercer. He had been my grandfather's business partner in the 1970s. According to family history, Thomas died in a car accident 20 years ago. But the records in front of me told a different story. There were bank statements dated only 5 years earlier with Thomas's signature. I looked at Reed. "He's alive." Reed nodded. "Looks that way." We continued searching. Then I found a folder marked Rutherford Mineral Trust. Inside was the original agreement Daniel had mentioned. I carefully opened it. The document confirmed that my grandmother had retained a significant interest in the mineral rights, but there was another clause I had never seen. If the family property was ever sold under fraudulent circumstances, the mineral rights would remain protected by the original trust. Robert's entire plan could collapse if this document was authenticated. But then, I found something even more disturbing. A list of payments showed Thomas Mercer receiving money from Robert Hayes for nearly 12 years. The amounts were enormous. Thomas wasn't just helping Robert, Reed said. He was funding him. I looked through the pages until I found the most recent transaction. It had occurred only 3 weeks earlier. He's still working with him. Suddenly, we heard a floorboard creak upstairs. Reed immediately raised his weapon and motioned for us to stay back. Someone was moving above us. We heard footsteps crossing the hallway. Then a door slammed. Reed and another agent rushed upstairs. Earl and I remained below. A few seconds later, Reed shouted, "He's gone!" We ran upstairs. A window stood open at the end of the hall. Whoever had been there had escaped through the back. On the floor was a small envelope. My name was written across it. I picked it up and opened it. Inside was a photograph of Daniel. He was standing beside Thomas Mercer. On the back, someone had written, "Daniel knows what Thomas did in 1979. I looked at Reed. "We need to find my brother." Reed nodded. "Agreed." My phone suddenly rang. It was Daniel again. "Sam," he said urgently, "you found Thomas's records, didn't you?" "Yes." "Then listen carefully. Thomas isn't the person you should be afraid of." I frowned. "Why?" Daniel's voice became tense. "Because Thomas has been hiding from the real mastermind." "Who?" There was a long silence. Then Daniel whispered a name I had never expected. "Harold's own father." I froze. "My grandfather." "Yes," Daniel continued. "He didn't just protect the mineral rights. He knew exactly why they were valuable." Then the line went dead. I stared at the phone, realizing that the story my family had told me about the farm had been built on a lie from the very beginning. And now, I was finally close to discovering what my grandfather had been hiding for nearly 50 years. The moment Daniel said my grandfather knew the real reason the farm was valuable, I felt as if the entire story of my family had shifted beneath my feet. I looked at Agent Reed. "My grandfather died 30 years ago. How could he be the mastermind?" Reed remained calm. "He may not have been a mastermind in the way you're thinking. We need evidence before we decide what his role was." I knew he was right, but the question wouldn't leave my mind. Why would my grandfather hide the truth about the farm from everyone, including me? We returned to the farmhouse with the documents Thomas had left behind. I placed the old mineral trust agreement on the kitchen table and began examining every page. Earl stood beside me while Reed photographed the documents. "Look at this," Earl said suddenly. He pointed to a handwritten note in the margin. The handwriting belonged to my grandfather. It read, "The mineral rights are not the real treasure, they are only the key." I stared at the sentence. "What does that mean?" Nobody answered. I turned the page and found another note. "Never allow the eastern field to be developed." That was the same area Daniel had mentioned years earlier. The eastern field. I remembered that part of the farm. It was mostly unused pasture with a small pond and an old barn. I had never understood why my grandfather refused to let anyone build there. Even when the property became difficult to maintain, he insisted that section remain untouched. Reed looked at the map. "Maybe we should inspect it." We drove toward the eastern field in Earl's truck. The afternoon sun was beginning to disappear behind the trees. The old barn stood exactly where I remembered it, leaning slightly to one side. I walked around the building and noticed a metal hatch partly hidden beneath the grass. "That wasn't there when I was young," I said. Earl knelt beside it. "It's old." Reed cleared the grass away and found a small lock. I tried the brass key from Thomas's farmhouse. It fit perfectly. The hatch opened with a loud metallic groan. Beneath it was a narrow staircase leading underground. My heart started pounding. "What is this place?" I whispered. Reed switched on his flashlight. "Only one way to find out." We descended carefully. The air became cold and damp. At the bottom, we found a concrete room filled with old filing cabinets. On the wall was a faded sign bearing my grandfather's initials. I opened the first cabinet. Inside were geological maps dating back to the 1970s. The second contained financial records. The third contained photographs. But the fourth cabinet was locked. I tried the key again. It opened. Inside was a thick folder marked Project Echo. I opened it and immediately understood why my grandfather had hidden everything. The documents described an experimental extraction project conducted in the region decades earlier. The mineral deposit beneath the farm wasn't merely valuable. It contained a rare material that could be used in advanced industrial technology. The project had been abandoned after concerns about environmental damage and political pressure. My grandfather had apparently purchased the farm to prevent the land from being exploited. "He was protecting the property," I said quietly. Reed nodded. "And maybe protecting everyone living nearby." Then I found another document. It showed that Morrison Energy had attempted to restart Project Echo nearly 20 years later. The proposal was rejected, but one person had continued pursuing it privately. Robert Hayes. My hands shook as I turned the page. Robert had apparently obtained old Project Echo files through Thomas Mercer. He believed the mineral deposit could make him extraordinarily wealthy. But the final document shocked me. It was a letter from my grandfather to Harold. "If they ever discover the eastern chamber, they will come for the family. Never sell the farm. Never trust anyone who says the land is worthless." Harold had followed his instructions for decades. Then I noticed another page hidden behind the letter. It contained a list of names: Robert Hayes, Charles Whitmore, Thomas Mercer, Victor Hartman, Daniel Pierce, and finally one name circled in red: Walter Rutherford. I stared at my son's name. Why would Grandpa circle Walter's name? Earl looked over my shoulder. Maybe he knew Walter would eventually be approached. But then I noticed the date written beside Walter's name. It was from 25 years ago, long before Walter ever met Robert. My heart began racing. That doesn't make sense. Reed took the page from me. He examined it carefully. Then his expression changed. "Sam, this isn't a prediction." "What?" He pointed at the handwriting beneath Walter's name. "Already compromised." I felt numb. If my grandfather had written that decades ago, then he knew something about Walter's future long before Robert approached him. And suddenly, a horrifying possibility entered my mind. What if Walter's betrayal wasn't the first betrayal in our family? The words "already compromised" kept echoing in my mind. I looked at Walter's name again, hoping there was some explanation that would make the document less disturbing. "He was only a child 25 years ago," I said. "How could Grandpa have known he would become compromised?" Reed carefully examined the page. "We don't know that he meant your son specifically. We need to establish what this document refers to." I shook my head. "Walter was only 28 when Grandpa died. Maybe Grandpa knew something about him that I never did." Earl remained silent, staring at the list. "What?" I asked. He finally looked at me. "Sam, Harold once told me your grandfather had serious concerns about Walter." My stomach tightened. "When?" "Years ago, before Harold died." "Why didn't she tell me?" "Because she didn't want to destroy your relationship with your son without proof." I felt a mixture of anger and sadness. Everyone seemed to know pieces of my family's story except me. My grandfather had hidden things. Harold had hidden things, Daniel had disappeared, and Walter had spent years lying. I opened the folder again, searching for anything that could explain the strange note. Beneath the list of names was another page containing dates. Robert Hayes, 1998, Thomas Mercer, 2001, Charles Whitmore, 2003, Daniel Pierce, 2014, Walter Rutherford, 2001. I stared at Walter's date. 2001, I whispered. Earl nodded. That's when Walter was still young. Reed pointed toward another notation. Look here. Beside Walter's name was a bank account number. It was an account I recognized. That's Walter's old savings account. I remembered that account. Harold had helped Walter open it when he was a teenager. Reed photographed the page. We need to trace this account. I shook my head. Why? Because if your grandfather recorded it here, there may have been activity connected to the conspiracy long before Walter met Robert. I felt sick. We returned to the farmhouse and contacted the bank through Agent Reed's office. Within an hour, investigators found something unexpected. The account had received a deposit of $25,000 in 2001. The sender wasn't identified by name, but the transaction originated from an offshore financial institution. Walter would have been barely old enough to understand what a bank account was. Who deposited it? I asked. Reed said, we don't know yet. And what happened to the money? Most of it was withdrawn over the next 2 years. I thought about Walter's childhood. He had always seemed normal. He played baseball, went to college, married young, and eventually started his own business. Nothing had suggested he was part of some hidden scheme. Then Earl remembered something. Sam, Walter worked for your grandfather during the summer of 2001. I looked at him. What did he do? He helped with paperwork and inventory. My heart sank. Could he have accessed the farm records? Possibly. We searched the old employment files. Walter had signed a temporary confidentiality agreement. It was routine, but there was a handwritten note attached. Walter requested access to geological archives. I stared at the words. Why would he request those? Earl shook his head. Maybe he was curious. Reed wasn't convinced. Or someone told him to look. Suddenly, my phone rang. It was Walter, I answered. Dad, his voice sounded frightened. Where are you? At the farmhouse. You need to leave. Why? Because I just remembered something. I stood up. What? In 2001, Grandpa gave me an envelope. My heart raced. What was inside? I don't know. He told me never to open it unless someone came looking for the farm. I looked at Earl. Do you still have it? Walter was silent. Yes. Where? In my penthouse. I couldn't believe it. Then bring it here. I can't. Why? Walter's voice dropped. Because someone broke into my apartment. I froze. Did they take the envelope? No, he paused. But they left something behind. What? A photograph of you. I felt cold all over. Where are you now? I'm driving toward the farm. I looked at Reed. He immediately reached for his radio. Tell him not to come. But before I could warn Walter, the call suddenly cut off. Seconds later, a message appeared on my phone from Walter's number. Dad, if I don't make it, open the envelope yourself. Beneath it was a photograph of an old sealed envelope bearing my grandfather's handwriting, and written across the front were 4 words that made my blood run cold. For Sam, when they return. The message from Walter stayed on my screen. Dad, if I don't make it, open the envelope yourself. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Then Agent Reed grabbed his radio. We need units on the road between the penthouse and this property. Find Walter Rutherford immediately. I called my son again. Straight to voicemail. I called a second time. Nothing. Earl looked through the farmhouse window. Sam, if someone broke into Walter's apartment, they may be following him. I nodded. Then we have to find him before they do. Reed stopped me. You're staying here. He's my son. And that's exactly why you're too emotionally involved. I wanted to argue, but he was right. I handed him Walter's last photograph. Can you track the message? We're trying. He gave the phone to another agent who began working through the carrier information. Meanwhile, Helen arrived at the farmhouse with Laura. I showed them the photograph of the sealed envelope. Helen stared at it for several seconds. "Sam, I recognize that handwriting. It's my grandfather's." She shook her head. "No, look at the bottom." I examined the envelope again. Beneath the words for Sam, "When they return," was a tiny symbol drawn in ink. Helen pointed to it. "Harold used this symbol too." My heart skipped. "What does it mean?" "It means the document was part of the family protection file." Laura immediately understood. "Then whatever is inside that envelope may be connected to the original trust." I looked at the clock. "We need Walter." Before anyone could answer, Agent Reed's phone rang. He listened silently, then looked at me. "They found his vehicle." My heart stopped. "Where?" "About 6 miles from here." "Is he alive?" Reed hesitated. "The vehicle was empty." We rushed to the location with the investigators. Walter's SUV was parked beside an abandoned gas station. The driver's door was open. His phone was lying on the passenger seat. There were no signs of blood or damage. Then one investigator found tire tracks leading behind the building. Reed followed them on foot. They ended near an old drainage tunnel. "Someone took him," Earl said. I couldn't breathe. Then I noticed something on the ground, a small envelope. I picked it up. It was the same envelope Walter had photographed. The seal was still intact. "They didn't take it," I whispered. "Walter must have dropped it." Helen stepped closer. "Open it." I hesitated. The words on the front suddenly felt heavier than paper. I broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter from my grandfather. "Sam, if you're reading this, then the people I feared have finally returned." I continued. He explained that decades earlier, he had discovered the mineral formation beneath the farm and realized several corporations wanted to exploit it. He refused to sell because the eastern field contained an underground chamber that had been used for experimental research. But the biggest secret was not the mineral itself. The chamber contained original geological records proving that the deposit extended far beyond our property. Whoever controlled the farm could potentially claim rights to a massive underground reserve. My grandfather had therefore created a private trust to protect the land and mineral rights for future generations. But he also admitted one mistake. I trusted Thomas Mercer. Thomas had betrayed him and secretly sold information to Robert Hayes. My grandfather discovered the betrayal too late. Then came the line that changed everything. "Robert is not the architect. He is only the collector. The person behind him has been waiting for the right moment to control the entire reserve." I looked at Helen. "Who?" She shook her head. I turned the page. The final paragraph read, "I never learned his full identity, but I know this. He has access to our family records, our finances, and our legal documents. If he returns, he will use someone close to you." Then I saw the final name written at the bottom. "Walter." I stared at it. "Why Walter?" Helen took the letter from my hands. Her expression changed as she read the next line written beneath his name. "Not because he is guilty, because they believe he can be controlled." I felt tears fill my eyes. All those years, my grandfather may have known Walter would become a target. Robert hadn't created my son's weakness. He had exploited it. Then a sound came from behind us. A vehicle approached the abandoned station. Everyone turned. A black SUV stopped near the entrance. The door opened. A man stepped out slowly. It was Daniel. My brother looked directly at me. "Sam," he said, "I'm sorry I'm late." I ran toward him, and for the first time in 15 years I embraced my brother. But after a few seconds, Daniel pulled away and looked toward the road. "We don't have much time." "Where's Walter?" I asked. Daniel's face became serious. "Alive," I exhaled in relief. "Where?" "With someone who can protect him." I stared at Daniel. "Who?" He looked at Helen. Then he said, "The person Harold trusted most." Before I could ask another question, sirens echoed in the distance. Daniel stepped closer and whispered, "Sam, your family wasn't fighting over a farm." He pointed toward the horizon. "You were protecting something worth hundreds of millions." and the people who want it are still coming. I looked at the farmhouse, the land, and the fields Harold had loved all her life. For the first time, I understood why she had fought so hard to keep it. The farm wasn't just property. It was a promise passed from one generation to another, and now that promise was mine to protect. But as Daniel led us toward another waiting vehicle, he handed me one final document. It was signed by my grandfather in 1979. At the bottom was a clause I had never seen before. The land may never be sold while a Rutherford heir remains willing to protect it. I looked at Daniel. What does that mean? He smiled sadly. It means, Sam, the farm was never meant to make you rich. He looked toward the fields. It was meant to make sure your family could never be bought. And from that day on, I finally understood that some inheritances aren't measured in dollars or acres. They're measured in the courage to protect what your family sacrificed everything to preserve. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to Heartline Narratives, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more emotional family stories like this one. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.